All right. I am now joined by our producer, Forrest. In fact, I'm going to throw Forrest the keys to the car in just a few minutes since I have another commitment in just a little while. But what we thought we were going to do for this is a couple things. So one, we want to expand a little bit on recent Biden antics since there's only a certain amount we covered last night. The episode was already going long, and we wanted to get into to a little bit more of this stuff, and it's so especially the airstrikes in Syria. But also, this is just a good chance. We'll talk about that, and then I'll leave, and Forrest is going to cover a little bit more of this, and then he'll take some Q&A, and from some super chat questions, and then I am going to go because I need to prep for a debate that I'm doing at the Modern Debate channel at 8 on Can Socialism Innovate? So that's and if you want to watch that, you don't have to go anywhere. You can don't touch that dial. You can stay exactly where you are, and since Forrest is still going to be here, he'll screen share, and you can watch the debate right here at 8, and then I don't know, maybe I'll pop back in for like 10 minutes to talk to Forrest about it after it's over. We'll see how drained everybody is at that point.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. I wish I could have talked to Ryan about getting him here to live comment on the debate.
Yeah, that would have been good. Although the two, I already talked to Ryan today because he was on the patron exclusive episode that's dropping on Thursday, which we recorded today. We were actually going to record it on Sunday, and then we would have had a preview to play last night. But there was the power was out in his neighborhood on Sunday, so he couldn't do it then. I tried to get him to do it in his car because I thought that would have been a funny twist on the conservative guy yelling in the driver's seat of his car genre of videos.
The other day he did the thing from his living room, whatever, on his phone, and it was pretty funny. He had those lights going, and it kept changing the light dramatically on this thing, so it looked like he was at a rave or something.
Yeah. So, but in any case, so we recorded that earlier this afternoon. So that's the Beginner's Guide to Kant, part 1, since we only had about an hour to talk this afternoon, and there's only so much Kant you can get to in an hour, with Ryan and Russ Sabriglia, and then Matt McManus. So again, that'll drop for patrons on Thursday. As far as other stuff to plug real quick before we get into the meat of what we're doing in the stream, there's going to be tomorrow Forrest and I, and also Ryan, and also Mikey Utrecht, and is that it? No, Doug Lane.
Yeah, I'm excited for. I didn't know until I saw Andy's picture that he did, his graphic that he did, that we were that Doug Lane was going to be joining us for that too. I'm excited for that.
Yeah, and he's somebody who I thought of right away when we were talking about doing Scatter Darkly, since he's he's a big Philip K. Dick guy. He's written and thought about, so this is such a man has such an unfortunate last name, because I realized that what that sentence was going to sound like. Doug spends a lot of time thinking about Dick, but in any case, so should be good. Should be good discussions. We're going to be talking about Scanner Darkly tomorrow night at 7 for the regular Wednesday movie stream. So Jennifer is going to be back on Friday for another Philosophy Friday live stream. I'm going to be talking about Kantianism, utilitarianism, and the trolley problem. And then on Sunday, we're doing something a little bit different. So, and once again, going to be tossing the keys to Forrest and Mark and Ryan. So that's Mark Warren and Ryan Lake, who've both been repeat guests on the Sunday night debate breakdown live streams. Are going to do one where they that I'm not going to be present for, where they watch and comment on the debate that I did with Douglas Wilson. So
yeah, I didn't see the whole debate. I saw the parts that you played, and like I saw, I think a little bit of it, like when we did the show right after. And I don't know, I'm really interested to see what they have to say about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I will be fascinated to watch that. But
like philosophy professors watching other philosophy professor series that.
yeah. So yeah, good. All good stuff. Coming up. But and then on Monday we're gonna have Thaddeus Russell back. I guess the last things that I should mention. Speaking of Doug Lane, I did a video for Zero Books that came out this afternoon. Which since I haven't done any videos for Zero in quite a while, right? Because I've been busy with this, but I'm trying to go back to that and do one each week for the several weeks leading up to the release of my new book from Zero Books, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns: Critique of the Contemporary Left, which is out on May Day. You can pre-order that from a bunch of places. As always, I'd recommend Red Emma's. Worker-owned bookstore in Baltimore. You can order books from online. So that's redemmas.org.
I always really liked they when Michael passed, they had a Michael Brooks like a reading list, and it was like your book and Boschkar's book, and because I was looking for Against the Web, and like they had like a really sweet like reading list of like all of you guys' work together. So I always appreciated that Red Emmas did that.
Nice. Yeah, no, it's yeah. I mean, I'm really glad that place exists, and I can recommend that. But yeah. So anyway, if we had a little bit more time, I'd play the video I did for Zero here on the stream. But since we do not, let me just plug the last pluggable, which is that the class that I'm teaching in April and May at Michael Albert's School for Social and Cultural Change is open for enrollment. So if you just Google School for Social and Cultural Change, you should see that. There are also, I think there's like 12 or 13 classes by different people that are being offered. So one of them is being taught by Noam Chomsky, and it's all for since it's all for the members of the general public. So it's not like college tuition. There's a there's a sliding scale, and the high end of the scale isn't very high. So do check that out. But since I could only stick around for about another 10 minutes before Forrest takes over, let's talk about Biden.
All right, it's time for our Biden update. So we touched on Syria last night a little bit. But one thing that I really wanted to get into today was the changing narrative, I guess, with how the airstrikes, just the damage done by the airstrikes, and it keeps getting worse as we hear more about it. So initially, and this is from the Politico article I read last night, President Joe Biden ordered an airstrike on facilities used by Iran-backed militia groups in eastern Syria on Thursday night in response to 3 cyber rocket attacks against U.S. forces in Iraq, according to a Pentagon spokesperson. The strikes destroyed several facilities at a border control point used by a number of Iran-backed militia groups linked to attacks against the U.S. forces in Iraq. So it was a pretty straightforward. I don't know. Like the president chose the middle option from a broad range of military options. It dropped 7 500-pound precision bombs on 7 targets. All bombs hit their targets. Crossing used by the militia groups to move weapons and other goods across the borders. Officials expect minimal casualties. So, it made it seem like this was a very minimal, airstrike that, not many casualties, just buildings. But of course, within days, and I saw that Glenn Greenwald posted this, the Independent released a thing that said at least 22 people were killed after President Biden orders his first military strike. And that's, the initial reports were that they just killed one person and injured 3, which they're precision bombs. So, of course, even if it did just injure 3, those injuries were fucking probably horrific. But, and that barely got any coverage that these stories are changing at all. So, that was kind of the first thing that I wanted to touch on with it. We don't really think about the damage caused by our military actions. And I think that we really need to start, especially the left, critiquing this in a very detailed manner, because, people don't like thinking about it, but you really do need to think about how much damage we're actually causing in these countries.
Yeah, no, clearly. And I think it really says something about how desensitized we are to it, that like they have like all like, we talk about, only a few people were killed, like that's that means it's not a big deal, which like just for the sake of contrast, think about how much of all of our time in the last couple months has been spent thinking about the riot on January 6th, where one person was maybe killed. Like, I know a couple of them, like, electrocuted their balls or had heart attacks or whatever, but like,
yeah, one person was killed by actual, like, direct.
Yeah. And we think that's a very, very big deal. And more to the point, maybe, I suspect, that if Syria, if Syrian agents had set off a bomb in Washington, D.C., in retaliation, for like something the U.S. had done in Syria, this perhaps, and it had killed 2 people,
that would be huge news. And I mean, even looking at like 9/11, which is, the one attack on our soil, we've been talking about it for like 2 decades at this point. You know what I mean? Like, this is the 2-decade anniversary of 9/11 at this point, 2001 to 2021. And we've talked about, considering how many people we've killed in the Middle East with all together in Afghanistan with our military actions, like, that one attack is something that we've been talking about, and that's changed our entire society for 2 decades.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, and again, that really shows the disconnect in how we think about it, with people who count and people who don't count, because obviously, those 3,000 people, who died on 9/11. I mean, that's a drop in the bucket, compared to the civilian death toll, even in Afghanistan. Never mind Iraq. But those are important people. And, if you aren't thinking about it that way, then like, why the hell, like, again, which, like we were talking about in the show last night, which is a bigger deal? Trump's, Trump having a sleazy phone call where he, threatened to delay military aid, or killing 22 people in a sovereign country that we're not at war with, that that was not authorized by Congress in any way. Like this should be a much bigger deal, and it really is just that simple. It's like this is a cheesy reference, but I remember there was a movie in like the late 90s called A Time to Kill, which was based on a John Grisham novel. Have you ever seen this?
No.
Okay. So it was it's like whatever. It's based on a John Grisham novel, so it's like a courtroom drama about this this murder that happens in the South, and there's a lot of like really over the top racist stuff going on in it. And the lawyer,
I think I've like read summaries of people using it as an example on things before, because that does sound familiar. I haven't read.
Yeah. So if you know one thing about this movie, this big speech by the lawyer hero at the end, his closing argument, is like he describes what happened and then said, "Now imagine that they were white," and it's like it really is on that level, right? Like, now imagine that they were Americans, and would we think that like 22 people, ended up being killed in this way was a big deal?
Here's something I guess to debunk. Millions would die without someone to fill the power vacuum. But we've been there. I mean, we've been in the Middle East for 2 decades now. Like, for the most part. I mean,
I also don't get what the claim is. Are we talking about Syria here? Like,
I mean, compared to like Afghanistan or Iraq, we're kind of barely in Syria.
Yeah, because if we're talking about Syria, then we know exactly who fill the power vacuum, to the extent that the U.S. like stopping militarily engaging in Syria at any point even would leave a power vacuum at this point.
Yeah. Well, Assad kind of, Assad's kind of taken back control of a lot of parts of Syria that, we were losing ground to ISIS, but then, our actions kind of, ISIS has been wiped out of a lot of these places. You know what I mean? So like we don't want Assad and Russia, like the American state doesn't want Assad and Russia to take back control of these parts of Syria, but like it's not our call. You know what I mean? Like regardless, it's not our call. Like
it's not. Yeah, it's not at all our call. And actually, this is like a really useful thing. Like, again, the sort of like simple role reversal exercises, even if you're talking about, we were talking about Syria, even if we were talking about like Afghanistan, well, okay. Like take the exact situation and imagine, I remember, credits where credit where credit is due, right? Crazy old, quasi-libertarian, reactionary, lunatic Ron Paul, I remember back in 2012 had a really good campaign ad about Iraq, or, I don't know, it was at least a pro Ron Paul ad, where the setup was, imagine that there were Chinese troops in Texas, and he went through all this stuff as like, look, would you call the people shooting at them terrorists? And of course, you could make the same argument there. Well, it would create a power vacuum, if they left. But obviously, nobody would think that was dispositive in that case. And I guess, like, what I'd also really say about that is, two things, right? One, if you're saying that we should stay in these countries for the sake of the people who live there, then like, hey, why don't we let them vote on that, right?
Yeah, we've killed an insane amount of people that live, in Syria, but also in the Middle East. Like all of these strikes end up killing so many fucking civilians that aren't involved, and they create terrorists because, like, if the American state is occupying your country, and all of a sudden, like a bomb goes off, like someone that would have never thought to become any kind of join any of these militia groups suddenly wants to, and it's been covered extensively. You know what I mean? Like people lose family members, people get injured, people lose children, people lose parents, like, and then suddenly for the rest of their lives, they're joining like a militia group. It's easy to radicalize them at that point. Like we're basically doing those militia groups jobs for them.
Yeah, for sure, right? If like so this is the question, right? Is this happening? Is like this continuing military involvement in the Middle East, is it for the sake of Americans, our national security? If so, then your point seems pretty relevant. That if it's actually like doing this, like if the concern is about global terrorism, coming back at Americans, well, there is a lot of evidence. Like every time there's some sort of terrorism trial, like the person on the dock pretty much always says, "Yeah, I wanted to get them back," for the, like bombings. Like it's not hard to understand.
And why wouldn't they? Like, you know what I mean? Like the role reversal thing. Like, let's say that that like living in the city or something, like the city gets bombed, you lose family members. Why wouldn't you want to fucking push back against the people that did that to your family? Like, it's not like they're defending themselves; they're defending allies, which actually brings me to another point that I wanted to make about the Syrian airstrike.
And I was just going to say real quick, like, so that's if it's for the sake of Americans' national security. If it's for the sake of the people who live there, I want to do a fucking vote, because like if you're going to say it's for their sake, to keep them safe from like whatever the consequences of a power vacuum are. Okay, well let's leave that up to them, right? Like let's have referendums in each of these countries about America stay or go, and then the third point is if the and I saw somebody asking, by the way, about World War II. I think that's actually a pretty instructive example because, what was at stake in World War II is which like imperial hegemon, got to run the world, and conspicuously, that's not at stake in any of this stuff, right? So there's no equivalent to Nazi Germany or Imperial, Japan, just taking over some huge sphere of influence if the United States, withdrew from Afghanistan, for example.
Yeah, no, it's all about regional influence, and that has nothing to do with national security. And within that same frame, I was watching the video that Democracy Now! Did about it, and it comes the day after Biden got off the phone with the King of Saudi Arabia, and and looking at it in the lens of Biden saying he's gonna stop all offensive support for things going on in Yemen. Like it's suddenly like the question of who is he doing this for is pretty fucking clear.
No, yeah, right. And so again, yeah, I mean, I think certainly like, okay, benevolently doing it for the sake of other people, to keep them from having to live through civil wars, which, by the way, like you get anyway, right? Like it's not like there's been any point in the last 20 years when there hasn't been bloodshed and fighting going on in Afghanistan.
Yeah,
in Iraq, there had been no civil war. There was one that was caused, by the U.S. intervention, but
yeah.
But it's one thing to say you're benevolently doing it for the sake of people who live in those countries. It's one thing to say that you're, to say that you're doing it for the sake of Americans' national security. And I have objections in both cases, but I at least get it. But it's like, I really, really don't want America to be fighting these wars as a favor to monarchs and despots and places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Yeah, and then the more you get into these things, the more favors you're doing for despots. You know what I mean? Like, so suddenly Biden's leaving Yemen, so then suddenly he has to do a favor for the King of Saudi Arabia. Then you know what I mean? Then he has to do a favor for another ally and like somewhere else. Like it's just like a never-ending chain, and it's the same thing with making the point that it's the same thing with making the point that there's nobody to fill the power vacuum. Like they're never-ending excuses. Because that's never it's never something that's going to stop there. You know what I mean? Like it just gets us further tangled into our.
I mean, at the very least, if you say we have to stay until X, Y, and Z conditions are met, I want a realistic estimate of when and how and why, those are going to be met.
Yeah. So here's Biden being asked in an extremely TMZ like video for some reason when he was in Texas about it.
Mr. President, what message would you send to Iran?
You can't act with impunity. Be careful.
See, so it's pretty clear that he's doing it to send a message to Iran, and then the question of who is he sending a message for? Well, Saudi Arabia, and it doesn't help Iran get to the negotiating table for another deal. So
it certainly doesn't. I mean, it makes that less likely, and it's also and it's also there's this obsession with Iran. Well, actually, I remember we played it on the show a while back. That old clip of Michael talking about Iran, where he's making a bunch of really good distinctions, and what he says is just absolutely right. It's like, look, I mean, obviously, you don't have to say anything nice about this regime, which is, obviously like horrifically socially conservative and this and that, and you can say also, sure, look, Iran does sponsor, is a regional player and plays according to some pretty vicious rules. but no more so than fucking Saudi Arabia does.
Exactly. And people love to say, oh, well, Iran sponsors terrorist groups. Saudi Arabia sponsors more terrorist groups than anybody. They put more funding into groups that we would consider, terrorist militias than anybody else. And at times, ones like groups that are literally fighting us. You know what I mean? Like in some of these places. It's a never-ending clusterfuck of people's interests, and it's a tightrope walk, because in one country you might be sponsoring a militia group that is aligned with your interests in that country, and then another one with completely different fucking interests.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I think certainly, like, if the goal, like, just assuming for the sake of argument, the goal is to get Iran, back to the back to the negotiating table, which is, by the way, like an incredibly fucked up thing to say. They're saying like, we need to ratchet up military aggression against them to get them to go back to the table so we can like restart an agreement that we were the ones who walked out of.
Yeah.
But like, if that is the goal, then like the United States currently has all kinds of incredibly punishing sanctions going on Iran. Like, I think if you want an incentive to restart a deal and normalize relations, I think just like, hey, we'll drop all of that, would do it. I mean, there's no, and this is also, again, this is a country that has like obviously is very invested in the sort of struggle for regional hegemony, with these other powers in the region, and they do all kinds of very violent things for the sake of that. But these are very limited ambitions. Like this is not a the Iran-Iraq War happened in the 80s, although I think the usual consensus position is Saddam Hussein started that, and then, but other than that, right? I mean, that's it, right? Like Iran hasn't, like what's the last country that Iran like invaded, right? Like when's the last time that happened? They'll certainly do things like ally with one side in a civil war that's happening somewhere, but what's the last time that Iran just like started like an aggressive war, a war of conquest?
No, it's almost exclusively proxy wars, and I mean, I'd like if you're asking for like a moral judgment, like no, It's not good that any side is funneling weapons to militias that then turn around and kill large sums of people. And it's not good that that there's any conservative theocratic state anywhere. But sure, that's not our fucking business. Like that's not reason to engage in the same kinds of proxy wars. And it's the opposite of what's going to get Iran to the table. Like but it's not about that. It's about signaling to our allies, quote unquote, like Saudi Arabia, that we're going to push back on Iran, which is something that Biden's done throughout his career. You know what I mean? And it's a message to Republicans that he's not going to be a soft president on Iran. Like it's, I don't know. Yeah. And he's done it over and over again. Like he pushed for the Iraq war. Like we watched those clips of Biden pushing for the Iraq war, and he pushed for it because he wanted to show that, I might be a Democrat, but I understand the threat that Saddam Hussein poses, and I believe the military intelligence, and I totally think that we should overthrow him just like the Bush administration. And then he turns around and then he pushes back on the Bush administration and says they didn't go far enough.
Yeah, and by the way, I mean, just in like purely cynical realpolitik terms, if you're concerned about Iran having too much of an influence in the region, like, guys, whose fucking fault is that? Like like everything that's happened in the last 20 years, that the United States overthrew, two of its most hostile enemies, Saddam Hussein and the Taliban, and by starting these wars, destabilizing the region and causing like civil wars spilling over into different countries, like created a situation where like Iranian proxies, could exert a lot more influence. Like if you didn't want Iran to have a bigger footprint in the region, then you should have stayed out of it in the first place, honestly.
Yeah, and also, they wouldn't even have the Ayatollah as a force if we hadn't done a coup there originally. and then had an incredibly unpopular leader that we put in, like dictator. You know what I mean? Like it was Iran was moving towards more of a democratic state. I mean, it wasn't, but like closer to that. And then
they were having elections. Like they had, like the coup in the 50s that established the Shah in the first place is what is what created the conditions for Iran to have the Islamic Revolution in the 70s. And it's like, oh God, what was that movie like 10 years ago about Iran and the hostage crisis? Do you have any idea what I'm talking about? It was like
hold on, I'll look up Iran.
It was like a big Hollywood movie. I'm just blanking on the name right now.
Is it Argo?
Argo, yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
Which I don't know.
Actually, I don't think I've ever actually watched Argo. It pops up on every single streaming service, and it's
like, we should get like maybe we should do a movie night, movie stream on that. We can get like Gene Bajalan and some other foreign policy people.
Yeah, I love talking to him whenever it's, or, you know what I mean, like. Just his accent is fucking great, but also interesting topics to go off of.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that movie, whatever you think of it, and like I know one of the criticisms, which I understand, was that like, it was almost all from the perspective of Americans, so the Iranians seemed very scary in the movie, and there were. Whatever. I'm not going to give everything away, but there were things that were kind of like over the top Hollywood kind of scenes. But that said, they do this little thing at the very beginning of the movie where they explain like the like how and why the Iranian Revolution happened. And I remember watching the theater and be like, oh, that's like shockingly honest for like a mainstream Hollywood movie. Like they're actually, it's like, oh no, like they're not just treating it as this like evil that came out of nowhere. They say, no, this is something that happened for reasons that make perfect sense if you understand the relevant history. But on that note, I really do need to get going to prep for the debate. I should, by the way, say I saw in the Jacobin WhatsApp group that somebody said that that Neera Tanden is officially toast now.
Yeah, that just popped up as a headline for me.
I think that maybe on Monday we should do like we should get like the music they use for the Oscars in memoriam stream. Like just do.
I'll do one of those, like a slow motion like black and white, like in memoriam or whatever.
Yeah, and go through a bunch of her tweets. So. All right. I might be back after the debate, but have fun without me.
All right. Send me the debate link.
Yeah, I'll text it to you.
Okay, cool. All right, taking over this stream. Gonna tank this show. All right. So I guess I'll continue with what I was saying with this. Hold on. Yeah, so it seems like Biden is trying to get back into the same pattern that's kind of, fully informed his political life for the last couple. Oh, by the way, if anyone has any super chat questions, I'll take them. But it seems like Biden's this tough on Iran thing. He did it with Saddam Hussein. He did it with. Even in Bosnia in the 90s, it was Biden that was pushing the hardest for us to go in there. And, he's always pushing for military intervention because he wants to make sure that we know that he's the one, he's the one Democrat that, all right, got a question? Send us a super chat and we'll answer it later in the episode, or I will. But yeah, he wants to make sure that Republicans know that he's the one Democrat that's going to fully have military interventionism as his primary goal, and that he's not weak. And this is always, putting himself as in opposition to liberals. And we went through that with the Iraq footage that we had a few weeks ago. Yeah, so okay. So one thing that I wanted to play was Biden saying that he wants to end the forever wars. And, you know, it's kind of funny to see now, but, you know, he ran on this campaign, and I think it's important to hold his feet to the fire on this.
It's long past time we end the forever wars, which have cost us untold blood and treasure.
Blood and treasure.
I have long argued that we should bring home the vast majority of our combat troops from the wars in Afghanistan and the Middle East and narrowly focus on our mission to deal with Al-Qaeda and ISIS in the region. And we should end our support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. It's hurting us.
So yeah, a very different Biden emerges
It's long
now.
past time we end the forever war.
I think Bernie Sanders is going to do everything in his power to force the vote on a minimum wage, because I think that he truly believes that, you know, it's long past due for us to have one. I'm not sure. Well, I mean, it's a completely different situation than force the vote on anything that's unpopular. Like, most Democrats would probably be forced to vote for the minimum wage, and it's just a couple of Democrats that are holding it up. I mean, at least, you know, I guess they could turn around and go, oh, we never really believed in this, but they literally ran on it. So I think that Bernie's going to do anything in his power to force the vote on minimum wage. I don't think that the Biden administration really cares that much to push for it. I mean, I don't think that Biden's going to stand in the way of it either if they decide that they have. Like, I don't think Biden's going to pull some sneaky shit behind the scenes, but I just don't think it's something that's very high on Biden's priority list. Yeah, so that's kind of, you know, I just don't I don't see politically how Biden could you know, go against that after promising it. If it got to the point where every single Democratic senator was willing to vote for it. And yeah, I think that is look, I think that is what he's doing. He's trying to establish his seriousness. I mean, he said it, you know, like in the video that we just played, you know, he said, oh, you can't act with impunity, which, what does that even fucking mean? And you know, an interesting footnote to this is that we, you know, it's been kind of confirmed that we don't know how, or at least the news media doesn't know how closely aligned with Iran that these militias even were. You know, the New York Times kind of had a slip up where they basically admitted this the other day. The New York Times headline affirms that, you know, the Pentagon, you know, affirms the Pentagon claim that the group that the U.S. bombed in Syria is backed by Iran, and then admits it doesn't actually know if the group has any link to Iran. You know, little is known about the group, including whether it is backed by Iran or related to the organizations that use the facilities the American airstrikes targeted on. Some American officials will contend that the group is merely a front for one of the better-known Shia militias. So, you know, it's. I think that he is trying to establish his seriousness, and after coming out against the war in Yemen, which is a big thing for Saudi Arabia, I think that you know, he wants to show Saudi Arabia that we're not just going to abandon them, and that we're going to yeah, that we're going to you guys talk about the PRO Act. I need to do like a more research detailed segment on the PRO Act, or, you know, we need to get somebody on that's an expert, because I'm not going to pretend that I'm a super expert on it, but I do think that it, you know, it's a really like almost revolutionary, considering the fact that we've had no, you know, pro union or pro labor legislation in a really long time. I think that, you know, I think it's important to codify a lot of this shit too, because, you know, we're reaching a point with this, like, where even the term worker is not, you know, it's not protected anymore with Prop 22 passing. And, you know, labor laws is going to be really important during this, because, you know, they're going to do anything that they possibly can to yeah, they're gonna do anything they possibly can to change the labor. Yeah, I agree with this too. But to make it so that people aren't even considered workers, they're considered gig workers, they're considered freelance contractors or whatever else. So I think that I'd like to talk to someone that's more of an expert on the PRO Act. I know Paul Prescott had a really good, actually edited the clip of it, but on the Jacobin show. Ben's gonna be back later, and he can explain that, but he's not on right now. But yeah, I'd like to get more in depth into the PRO Act. I mean, it's terrifying to have such a, like, we make a big deal about Amy Coney Barrett's connections to we make a big deal about her connections to like these kind of the Christian groups, and like we don't make a big enough deal about the fact that she has like literally the most pro-business voting record of any judge that Trump could have possibly picked, which is the real reason why he picked her in the first place. And these things should be pressed harder by, I mean, liberals and the left in general. All right, so yeah, so keep those super chat questions coming, and we're gonna watch Ben's debate at 8. Ben's debate: can socialism innovate? Here, let me just throw this on screen. So this is the debate we're going to be watching. It's a tag team debate. Can socialism innovate? But I agree that it has as much to do with Israel as it does with Saudi Arabia. And it has as much to do with Republicans, honestly, as it has to do with Israel and Saudi Arabia. It's Biden signaling that he's not going to be soft on Iran, which is it's the wrong case to make. But even when all of his nominees were picked, they were pressing his nominees on the Iran deal because Republicans want this endless war, and Democrats obviously do too. But just the fact that the Obama administration negotiated this really quite unfair to the Iranian government, this deal that was like the crowning achievement of their of their foreign policy and their diplomacy. And Biden claims to be this big diplomacy guy, but he's trying to signal to Republicans that he's going to be tough. But 22 people died to fucking make the point that Biden's going to be tough. All right, so another story that I wanted to cover quickly before we go to Ben's debate is the fact that Biden reopened a child migrant facility that was closed during the Trump administration, and he rightly has faced backlash for this. And now this, which you wouldn't expect to do a good video on, it did a good video on the backlash that they've received for it. But this is, I think, is a pretty good analysis of it. Hold on.
Why is the Biden administration reopening a temporary facility for migrant children in Texas?
Well, first, the policy of this administration, as you all know, but just for others, is not to expel unaccompanied children who arrive at the border. And the process, how it works, is that Customs and Border Control continue to transfer unaccompanied children to the HHS Office of Refugee Resettlement. That can take a couple of days. I just want to give this context because people need to understand the process. But because of COVID-19 protocols, the social distancing requirements, the capacity of existing Office of Refugee Resettlement shelters has been significantly reduced because, of course, you can't have a child in every bed. There needs to be spacing, and we abide by those spacing to protect the kids who are living in those facilities for a short period of time. And to ensure the health and safety of these kids, HHS took steps to open an emergency facility to add capacity where these children can be provided the care they need before they are safely placed with families and sponsors. So it's a temporary reopening during COVID-19. Our intention is very much to close it, but we want to ensure that we can follow COVID protocols as unaccompanied minors come into the United States.
But it's the same facility that was open for a month in the Trump administration, summer 2019. That is when Joe Biden said, under Trump, there have been horrifying scenes at the border of kids being kept in cages. And Kamala Harris said, basically, babies in cages is a human rights abuse being committed by the United States government. So how is this any different than that?
We very much feel that way. These are facilities. Let me be clear here. One, there's a
You
pandemic
very much
going
feel
on.
that way.
I'm sure you're not suggesting that we have children right next to each other in ways that are not COVID safe, are you?
I'm suggesting that Kamala Harris said that this facility, putting people in this facility, was a human rights abuse committed by the United States government. And Joe Biden said, under Trump, there have been horrifying scenes of at the border of kids being kept in cages. Now it's not under Trump; it's under Biden.
This is not kids being kept in cages. This is kids. This is a facility that was opened that's going to follow the same standards as other HHS facilities. It is not a replication, certainly not. That is never our intention of replicating the immigration policies of the past administration.
So instant hypocrisy by the Biden administration. And I think that it's really important to notice how almost grotesque it is that this COVID safe language is being used and deployed. And they use it in other places too. The Washington Post, they're being reopened under HHS. It's different than ICE. Like, these are different. We're dealing with the welfare of children here. So Mark Weber, a spokesman for the Department of Health and Human Services, the agency that oversees services for migrant children, so the Biden administration is moving away from a law enforcement focused approach of the Trump administration to one in which child welfare is more centric. At the 66-acre site, groups of beige trailers encircle a giant white dining tent, a soccer field, and a basketball court. There's a bright blue hospital tent with white bunk beds inside. Every kid that comes into this program is a symptom of a broken immigration system. So today we've got over 7,000 symptoms of a broken immigration system. And, it's grotesque that, suddenly this welfare style, this welfare language is being used instead of, the more, evil Trump law enforcement approach, which, they're still fucking keeping children in migrant detention centers. So, I don't know, like the language is grotesque in this case. And the fact that, Jen Psaki pushing back on it, going, do you really want children to be kept in unsafe ways during COVID? It's just, it's something that I wanted to point out. And this isn't even the only migrant detention center that Biden's reopening. He's reopening one that Trump had opened in Florida, which even more grotesquely, I guess, it's unclear if Caliber and the private company that was contracted under the Trump administration to run the facility will continue as the facility's operator. When the center reopens, it will be the first time it takes children since closing in 2019. Shortly before it was shuttered, the Herald reported that John Kelly, Trump's one-time chief of staff, was on the board of the private company, which he remains on today. And that barely got coverage under the Trump administration. Number one, that, these child detention centers, John Kelly was on the board of the fucking company that was contracted to deal with them. As liberals were saying, oh, it's the adult in the room, John Kelly. And it's just another, it's another sign of hypocrisy. And, you can find an endless amount of videos of both Biden and Kamala Harris going around and telling us how abhorrent Trump's immigration policy was. And, I don't know. It's something that's worth covering. And I think these Biden updates are going to be increasingly important because, the media is not going to cover it to the same level they did with Trump. The media is not going to have the same level of outrage. And you're going to see, as they always do, but, things like the Syria airstrike, it's going to be increasingly that, they're exactly, literally the same facilities. Yeah. And at the same time, you know, Biden is claiming that, you know, coming down the pipeline really soon is this immigration bill that's going to be the most sweeping bill that's been passed since the 1980s. It's going to fix the immigration. Biden's had just as much of a hand in creating our immigration system, the broken immigration system that's led to 7,000 symptoms, as much as anybody else. So, you know, covering these things are going to be important, because I think that there's going to be an increasing focus on Biden saying things like, oh, I'm planning to support this immigration bill that's going to be the most sweeping that we've had, immigration reform. We're going to fix this broken system, when he had just as big a hand as anyone else in power in creating the system in the first place. So, you know, when you know, I think it's important that things happen where people push back, because it's not going to happen in mainstream media, you know. So covering these stories are going to be increasingly important. I mean, right now, Washington Post seems to have done a good job writing this out, but yeah, I mean, also, you know, things like Jacobin and you know, like leftist papers are gonna, or you know, magazines are gonna be increasingly important. So that's another story that I wanted to cover, and I guess a last story I wanted to quickly cover. I have to pull up the tweet, but Biden kind of half-heartedly took a stand in favor of the Amazon union, which I obviously doesn't go far enough. He never uses the word Amazon in it. And Bernie responded to his tweet and very much did use Amazon and made sure everybody knows that's exactly who he's talking about. But he did come out in support of unions in general, and he has, you know, in this case at least, done pro-union messaging. Which, I mean, you know, who knows how you know, who knows how far he'll follow through on that. But it is nice to see Biden, you know, vaguely doing pro-union messaging with this video that he released. I don't think he's ever going to push back on Amazon as a company, because, you know, they rely on Amazon for so much, including creating like this giant cloud service for the military the CIA and FBI, and, you know, in general, these, like, you know, they rely on them for these giant tech databases and stuff. But, you know, just it really makes you feel like, you know, we've had such anti-union representation, you know, in the White House, that even a vaguely pro-union video, even a vaguely pro-union, you know, message from Biden seems like it's a step in the right direction, I guess, which is kind of a sad thing.
I've long said America wasn't built by Wall Street. It was built by the middle class, and unions built the middle class. Unions put power in the hands of workers. They level the playing field. They give you a stronger voice for your health, your safety, higher wages, protections from racial discrimination and sexual harassment. Unions lift up workers, both union and non-union, and especially black and brown workers. I've made it clear when I was running, that my administration's policy would be to support unions organizing and the right to collectively bargain. I'm keeping that promise. You should all remember, the National Labor Relations Act didn't just say that unions are allowed to exist. It said that we should encourage unions. So let me be really clear. It's not up to me to decide whether anyone should join a union. But let me be even more clear. It's not up to an employer to decide that either. The choice to join a union is up to the workers. Full stop. Full stop. Today and over the next few days and weeks, workers in Alabama and all across America are voting on whether to organize a union in their workplace. This is vitally important, a vitally important choice as America grapples with the deadly pandemic, the economic crisis, and the reckoning on race. What it reveals, the deep disparities that still exist in our country. And there should be no intimidation, no coercion, no threats, no anti-union propaganda. No supervisors who confront employees about their union preferences. You know, every worker should.
Yeah, So I mean, it's not a perfect message. I don't see Biden saying that they're going to have legal backing behind it or anything, but it is, it does make you realize how we haven't had any kind of even vaguely pro-labor or pro-union president, within the last few years. And even this is a step in the right direction, I guess. I wish he had mentioned Amazon by name. Of course, he obviously isn't going to, but at least not in a statement like this. But Bernie had a great response to this, where he very much called out Amazon specifically. Said, if Amazon workers in Alabama, a strong anti-union state, vote to form a union, it'll be a shot heard around the world. If they can negotiate higher wages and better working conditions in the South, it'll benefit every worker in America. Thank you, Mr. President, for speaking out. So this is an example of Bernie kind of holding his feet to the fire, realizing that he didn't say, Amazon workers. And I really appreciate that, obviously, about Bernie. I think that Bernie's kind of, it's like a frog in the scorpion situation, I guess. The Biden administration is going to fuck him over every chance they get. But yeah. All right. To the questions that that this is an HHS facility instead of an ICE facility. I mean, but it's the same facility that the Trump administration used that they closed. Like and this is not a good first showing of what Biden's priorities are going to be. I don't know. I mean, look, it's something to watch out for. I don't think necessarily that it's worth saying, oh, the Biden administration is going to be just as bad as the Trump administration. But look at the Obama administration and ICE. Like they vastly increased ICE's power. I agree with this point. But I don't know. I mean, it's still children in a fucking detention center, and using COVID or welfare-based language instead of using law enforcement-based language. It doesn't. It's still children in a fucking detention center. All right. We're waiting on Ben's debate. It should be starting any minute now. Also, anything is a fucking step in the right direction from ICE detention centers. That's not it's not enough based on what fucking Biden ran on, and the amount of the amount of upset that Trump's immigration policy caused. It's I honestly don't have any hopes that Biden's gonna probably push away from some of the most extreme Trump policies, but I don't see some vast difference between some of the most horrific things that the Trump administration's done and what Biden's probably going to do. I mean, just the Syria airstrikes is a perfect example. Biden has no interest in challenging the systems of power that exist. In fact, he created a lot of the systems of power that exist, and I think that this is something that we should cover. But I think that we had the ability. We had the ability to go in a different direction. We had the ability to turn back some of the worst parts of neoliberalism. I don't think that Bernie would have been some miraculous push towards socialism for us, but he would have been a different direction, and it would have been a mandate to say that this system isn't working for people. Biden is not that. Biden is the system continuing to perpetuate itself. I don't know. I agree with this. And I see there's creating an equivalence between Trump and Biden. These things build on each other. These administrations build on each other, right? These administrations are not, it's not like these policies that each one has towards militarism and, towards the policies that we have. I don't know. I just, the policies that these administrations have, they don't really radically change based on what party is in power. I mean, not our, yeah, there's there's definitely symbolism in the fact that Biden's also so old he's barely able to hold it together. 100%. But this is what really blows my mind about it. Like they don't. It's not like one party takes power, we go in one direction. Another party takes power, we go in another direction. When it comes to our foreign policy, when it comes to things like ICE, like the Bush administration created ICE, and then Obama expanded ICE's power. Trump expanded ICE's power even further to horrific levels. Maybe Biden will pull that back a little bit, but it's still building on the same policy and fine-tuning it. You know what I mean? Like it's not, and we don't see these, like we see these parties on opposite sides of a political spectrum, but when it comes to any meaningful change, they're not. And I think that it's worth hitting on that point over and over again. The thing that the president has the most power over is our foreign policy. Like Congress doesn't really need to do much. I mean, they're pushing back on it, saying that, it's not really the War Powers Act. But even if Congress voted on it, the depressing thing is Congress would most likely, vote to do whatever the Biden administration wanted in terms of foreign policy. Like, I don't think that, it's kind of depressing that Congress is our big bulwark against this stuff when they've shown over and over again, and many of the same people are in power that, and 100%, and and then even you have things like Neera Tanden running for director of the OMB. Like it's I think it's a good point of hypocrisy that she had mean tweets. Trump has mean tweets, and the Biden was running even on the basis of, oh, we're going to be different. We're not like Trump. We're not divisive. Like, sure, like push back on that bit of hypocrisy, but like the only person really pushing for the fact that Cap took all of these political donations from Wall Street and all these companies was Bernie. Like, it's not like Republicans obviously don't give a fuck about that, and then Democrats see their own person running and they want their own enforcers. All right, it seems like Ben's debate is about to start, so here I'll put it as a thing, and then I'll probably put it on full screen. So, I mean, there's no point in me reacting to it besides to be like, yeah, go Ben. Kind of big watching like a friend compete in a sports event or something like that. Yeah, I like that. I like that Ben, the no honeymoon for Biden thing. He wrote the article for Jacobin about that. I don't, and it seems like less than other presidents, Biden hasn't really had. There hasn't really been the opportunity to give Biden a honeymoon. I mean, obviously, obviously, mainstream media would love to. Like, they'd love to say, well, look, Trump is out, but we're in the middle of this pandemic, and what the Biden administration does in terms of believing the science. So the topic of the debate is can socialism innovate, and it's a tag team debate. And why? Because it's Ben. He's always he's the master. He's the master of debating. But yeah. Oh Jesus, I feel bad for that. Well, when CPAC or something like that does have criticisms of the Democratic Party's foreign policy, it's going to be something like they're soft on China or they're soft on Iran, which only pushes the Democratic Party farther right, which is why they have those criticisms in the first place, right? Like, I mean, maybe it's for the best that CPAC doesn't criticize the Democratic Party's foreign policy, because the only service that they're going to have is to push them farther right. It's interesting though that conservatives are sometimes this like weird amalgamation of things. So like somebody like, I don't know, somebody like Rand Paul is kind of pushing the same, which I don't think Rand Paul really has an actual critique of our foreign policy, but still, like, somebody like Rand Paul or Mike Lee will push with Bernie to end the war in Yemen, which I don't think that they really have an objection to our militarism. They have an objection to the spending that goes with it and all of that. But, it's interesting that there's this amalgamation of somebody like Rand Paul or somebody like Mike Lee, and then on top of that, like someone like Ted Cruz or like, you know, somebody that really is going to push us into the most fucking hawkish policy that they possibly can. So I don't know. It's I mean, obviously CPAC is the worst of the worst, and it's going to be, you know, people that that it's not that way, but yeah, I agree with that. I'm not, or you know, maybe not fully fascist, but in that, you know, what Trump was like, I kind of consider that like proto-fascism. Like I don't think it was fully realized, but you know, I don't think that conservatives. I mean, I'm directly talking about foreign policy here. I mean, you know, the libertarian side of it, 100% is feudalist. But you know, when it comes to foreign policy, they have critiques of military intervention. Now, I mean, it's not gonna, like, if there was a libertarian government, we'd have tons and tons of privatized intervention. Oh, here we go. Damn, that's some pumped up music.
Dancing in the streets, there's nothing left to eat. We're on a winning streak.
And yeah, I mean, you know, they're just conservatives. Yeah, but like conservatism is a weird fucking ideology in general, because they're willing to get pushed really far into these what I would call fucking proto-fascist moral panics, where you're willing to give the keys to the state for everything. I don't know. I think that we've seen that there's no limit to how far right a lot of conservatives will go. There really is. I mean, you know, a lot of the people that were the MAGA supporters that, you know, were willing to push far into that, I think would consider themselves conservative. It's you know, I don't know. And yeah, I agree with this, but you know, I don't think that looking at Bush's pre-presidency really works in a place where we're in a post 9/11 world, because it's informed so much of our fucking, you know, it's informed so much of how conservatives and liberals think about foreign policy. I don't know. I don't know if that song is gonna get us demonetized. So I might just check back when the debate actually starts and it gets out of this. I don't know. I hope you guys are having fun. This is like my first time taking the reins of this. I don't know. It's time for debate ball. Hell yeah. Let me see if it's started yet. Yeah, I don't. Thanks, brother, man. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, even if there are limits right now, like, you know, how far are they going to be? How far are they really going to be pushed on it? Like, it seems like endlessly. Like, I don't know. And I think that it really doesn't serve us very well that we have, you know, that, and this is on purpose, but the Democratic and Republican parties have, you know, very much created a situation where liberal and conservatives are seen as two opposite poles on a weird political spectrum, which they're not. They're fairly close together, at least on economics. You know what I mean? And on foreign policy, they're, you know, they seem to be, you know, they seem to be exactly together in a lot of cases. Like, there's no real difference between it. But, you know, it stands to make sure that as many people as possible see this as like a party fight and not as something that actually impacts their lives. And then those are the only two choices that they have. And then, you know, they see themselves somewhere in the middle. Somewhere in the middle of such a fucking tiny axis. So yeah, I appreciate all the love I'm getting on here. Ben says the debate's about to start, so you know, I just didn't want to. I guess I'll mute it, but I didn't want to play the music of it if it's gonna get our video taken down. Watching another podcast besides Give Them an Argument. But he hasn't been doing them. I tuned into some of them when he you know first started them. I don't know. It's just it's hard to watch political content lately that you know that I'm not like either editing or like you know all right, looks like they're about to nope, not yet. I don't know. It's hard to watch political content that I'm not like editing or something because it's so fucking depressing. The point that we're at, and I don't know. It just felt so hopeful like a year ago. I mean, I think probably most people would have, you know, or more than a year ago, I guess at this point. But you know, like a year and a couple months ago, like yeah, or you know the like moderate on a very fucking tiny axis, right? Like, and as it moves farther right, all right, debate's starting right now. We'll talk about this next time.
Juicy debates in the future, including Matt Dillahunty will be back to debate whether or not Jesus fulfilled prophecy.
Can you guys hear this?
A blast that's coming
audio
up this month with Samuel Nassan, and you don't want to miss it. Also,
very excited, folks. What we're going to do is introduce our guests. We're thrilled to have them. We're really thankful they're here. This is going to be a lot of fun. Want to let you know, folks, their links are in the top of the description. So if you're listening, you're like, I like that, and you want to hear more, you can hear more by clicking on those links in the description box. In fact, what we're going to do is for our speakers, we're thrilled to have them here. We're going to give them a chance to share. We want to hear what we could expect to find at your links, gentlemen. So we'll start with Ben. Glad to have you back, Ben. What can people expect to find at your
link in the description?
That's our boy.
Yeah, so they can find the YouTube channel and podcast that I host. Give Them an Argument. And
hell yeah, they can.
Burgess.com there. You can also find the Jacobin articles and a bunch of other stuff.
You got it. Thanks so much. And Brenton, glad to have you back as well. What can people expect to find at your link?
Sure. So my name is Brenton Lengel. I am a playwright, political commentator, and the author of Snow White Zombie Apocalypse, the comic series, Ringo nominated. At my link, you're going to find my channel where we talk about arts, philosophy, radical politics, and Buddhism. And also, for those of you who are interested in the comic series of Snow White Zombie, we are just about to go into final Kickstarter fulfillment for issue number 3. So if you want to jump on there, there's a link for hosted pre-orders you can find on my website, brentonlengel.com, and also check my YouTube channel, and you can grab one of the issues before they go to print. So that's really exciting.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Brenton. And with that, we'll kick it over to the team that is arguing that socialism cannot innovate. So we'll start with Keith. Glad to have you, Keith. What can people expect to find at your link?
There's a website that I'm the chief editor of called attackthesystem.com, and it's a general news and commentary site that presents ideas from what might be called a heterodox anarchist perspective. And I'm also the co-host of a podcast called Kick the Puppy.
You got it. We're thrilled to have you here, Keith. And Todd, glad to have you with us. What can people expect to find at your link?
You can find me at the, I'm searching in the YouTube search engine, Praise of Folly Podcast. And you can expect to hear talks about religion, history, politics, philosophy, and economics.
You got it. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. And what we're going to do for today's format, just want to let you know, folks, it's going to be interweaved in terms of the opening statements. And so we'll start with Ben, and then we will kick it over to the opposite team where Todd will have roughly 7 minutes as well. And then we'll go to Brenton for about 7 minutes as well. And then finally Keith for about 7 minutes. So we will jump into that shortly, but want to let you know, following those openings, we'll have open conversation and then Q&A. So if you happen to have a question, feel free to tag me in the live chat with @ModernDayDebate. That way I can be sure to see your question and get it into that Q&A list. For that Q&A part, it'll be about 30 minutes or so. And with that, we are ready to start the opening statement. So Ben, the floor is all yours. I've got the timer set for you. Thanks for being here.
All right, thank you, James. So if you're going to ask whether socialism can innovate, the obvious first question is, what do you mean by socialism? So I think broadly speaking, what we mean by socialism is no longer having society being divided into a class of people who own businesses, a capitalist class, and a class of people who work for the first class, the working class. That instead of that, there's some important sense in which the means of production, distribution, exchange, finance, all that good stuff are, the economic resources of the society are socially owned. So if the claim that the other side wants to make is there are some versions of socialism, or there's some things that having that be socially owned mean that might be bad for technological innovation, then yeah, sure. I have no problem with that. Of course, there are some ways that capitalism could work that would be bad for technological innovation. Arguably, for example, if you did what a lot of anarcho-capitalists want and abolished all intellectual property protections, then the incentives that companies have for certain kinds of innovations to increase market share might go away. Would things work out that way? I don't know. It's speculative, and now you see the problem. So let's talk about what we mean when we talk about socialism. And the first thing to make clear is that certainly what I mean when I talk about socialism is not primarily the sort of experiments and authoritarian state planning that existed in the 20th century in places like the Soviet Union and Mao's China. If you want to talk about the actual technological record of those societies, it's a mixed bag. The Soviet Union did beat us to space, but I'm not primarily interested in exploring the question of whether innovation, to what extent it was happening in those societies, because whereas it's a fascinating question for historians of those societies, that's not the model that I advocate. So on the other end of the spectrum, you could talk about the optimistic projection, most optimistic possible projection of how socialism could work, what the kids call fully automated luxury communism, where the idea there is that as even many libertarian futurists believe, technological progress is eventually going to get us to the point where most of the work that's currently done by humans can be done by machines. Well, if you think that prediction is right, and of course there's lots of room for debate about that, but if those machines are still privately owned, the results could be a disaster for most of the human race. The best we could hope for is like Yang bucks as a 21st century equivalent of an ancient Roman bread ration. But if the machines are collectively owned, then we could all make a collective democratic decision to just work fewer hours with no loss in standard of living. And maybe the idea is, this is an idea that goes back to like Karl Marx and his Fragment on Machines from Grundrisse, that at the end point of that process, so little work still has to be done by humans that you don't need to link work to income in order for it to be done. Some people will choose to spend their free time playing video games and spending time with their family. Some people will write really bad poetry, and some people will pursue their passion for computer engineering. And that will be enough to get what work still needs to be done by humans done just as a hobbyist passion. Now, that's extremely optimistic. Will that actually happen? I have no idea. I think it's a useful horizon, even if we never completely get there. Would technological progress grind to a halt once we got there? If we did, I doubt it, because you have so many people who are potential technological innovators who currently have to spend their lives working in fields or in Jeff Bezos' sweatshops, who would be freed up to make their contributions to society. But I will freely acknowledge that it's hard to make predictions with any great degree of certainty about how a society so unlike our own would work if it came into existence. And I think it's a little bit more interesting to try to do something grounded, which is instead of just speculating about what a really advanced form of socialism might look like, to think about the kind of socialism we could have right now, 5 minutes after capitalism. So don't make any assumption about a bunch of technological progress having happened first, or any sort of cultural progress having happened first. Just only assume massive, massive political progress. That's it, right? That assume a political tectonic shift that would allow for the complete expropriation of the current owners of the means of production, but don't assume anything else. What could that look like? Well, the sort of model that I've talked about, I have an article in Jacobin about this called "Capitalism Is It Working?" But what would effective socialism look like, or something like that. Working on a book about this. You can read Bhaskar Sankara's Socialist Manifesto, the first chapter, where it gets into this. But basically, if you want to know how you could have a functioning society without a capitalist class, without this separate class of people owning but not working in the means of production, then you could just take elements that already exist in real life. So we already have plenty of successful examples of advanced Western democracies nationalizing certain industries and running them as public utilities in a completely decommodified way. Think, for example, the NHS in Britain, which is so wildly successful that even conservatives have to pretend to support it, or they'd never win another election again. And we already have successful private sector worker cooperatives. So, most strikingly, for example, the Mondragon Corporation in Spain. And so if you had a society where you no longer had a capitalist class, you no longer had a separate class of people owning but not working, in the farms, the factories, the offices, the stores, etc., because that had been gobbled up on the one hand by an expanded state sector for what are sometimes called the commanding heights of the economy, for things we really want to be decommodified completely. In other words, we don't want to be treated as commodities to be bought and sold, such as healthcare. And on the other hand, if you did still need to have a private sector to solve any sort of calculation problems, it could at least be a private sector or quasi-private sector if it was renting the physical means of production from the state of competing internally democratic worker cooperatives. So finally, the question is, would such a society be able to innovate? Well, here's the problem. If you want to say no, we'd have two sectors here, cooperative sector and a state sector, and both of those in the real world do innovate like crazy. So the Mondragon Corporation does lots of technological development. In fact, companies like Microsoft and General Motors have partnered with them because they're so good at it. And the state sector does tons of innovation. Look at how much technological development happened, how quickly during World War II. We basically got atomic weapons and radar, over the course of just a few years. The fact that we're doing this right now on the internet, which was an invention of the state sector, from DARPANET. The fact that in all of our phones we have GPS, which was originally developed, by the state sector, strongly indicates that yes, it can. So if by innovation we mean technological innovation, technological progress, then yeah, the record's pretty clear. If we have a broader, somewhat looser definition of innovation, that's about like just entrepreneurial creativity, then if you want to argue that the society being described could not have that, then you need to explain what about market incentives is different in a market sector of worker cooperatives or a market sector of regular capitalist businesses, and good luck to you.
Thank you very much, Ben, for that opening statement. We will kick it over to Todd. So kicking it over to the opposite team now for about 7 minutes, roughly, as well. And so, Todd, the floor is all yours.
All right. The labor theory of value is central to the economic analysis of socialism, especially with regards to the theory of exploitation. But does the LTV provide a solid basis for a comprehensive analysis of political economy? The main problem I see is that it cannot adequately account for intellectual products such as art and technological innovation. A central component of the LTV is socially necessary labor time, which can be defined as the amount of labor time performed by a worker of average skill and productivity, working with tools of the average productive potential to produce a given commodity. This is an average unit labor cost measured in working hours. Whatever can be said for the SNLT with regards to mass-produced goods, it becomes very difficult to envision how the SNLT could account for singular works, such as technological innovation and artistic creativity, or broadly speaking, intellectual works. Such a work is a breakthrough, and breakthroughs by their nature do not have average cost of production. As such, this means intellectual products are outside of the valuation process of the LTV. If one cannot calculate the value of intellectual goods via the SNLT, then how in a socialist economy is such a good to be appraised? It would seem that any such appraisal would have to come from some other method of analysis, but therein lies the problem. The socialist claims that the LTV to be an exhaustive explanation of the political economy, which it is in fact not. Under the principle that that which is not valued or not properly valued will not be produced, I predict that under a socialist system which is governed by the LTV, such intellectual goods as technological innovation and artistic creations will either go underproduced or not produced at all. It would, let's see here, not produced at all, as the means of production is not an intellectual good. Sorry. If socialism is to be understood, the socialist claims the LTV to be an exhaustive explanation of the political economy, which in fact is not. Under the principle that which is not valued or not properly valued should not be produced, I predict that under a socialist system which is governed by the LTV, such intellectual goods as technological innovation and artistic creation will go underproduced or not produced at all. This critique is also applicable in a broader sense. If socialism is to be understood as the democratization, then we have the problem of diseconomies of scale. In a diseconomy of scale, for instance, each increase in production, there is an increased unit cost. For our purposes, an opportunity cost. Let's say you want to tell a story in 2 hours, all well and good, but what if 2, 3, or 4 in the same amount of time? You will have less time to devote to each story, making them all weaker than just 1 2-hour story. This leads to a scope problem. In a traditional society, you really only have one interest to consider in the context of creating art, a tiny aristocratic elite that more or less shares the same values across time and between nations. Think ancient Greece and medieval Europe. This allows for the specialization and focus. You only have to keep a small cohesive group satisfied, which allows for clear norms of method and message. If you have a democratic art scene, then you have 2 problems, the problem of genres and the problem of ideologies. In order to cast the widest possible net, you will have to include as many genres and ideologies as possible to get as many people as possible to take notice of your work. The problem being is that genres and ideologies are contradictory. Imagine a brooding psychological action film mashup or a thriller romantic comedy. It just won't work. If you leave out people's ideologies and they complain, why have you left me out? This wide casting of the net prevents people from having a prescribed method, form, and message, reducing the content to an incoherent mess with no message or structure. Thus, we see that the mission creep of democratic taste leads to a diseconomy of scale in the arts, which will in turn lead to an underproduction at best of quality art. If by democratizing the workplace you enfranchise those who own the means of production, what about those sectors of the economy where the producer need not own the means of production? For example, a theoretical mathematician, his job is to discover mathematical breakthroughs, but that job does not require ownership of capital. Since there is no SNLT account of a breakthrough, how could a theoretical mathematician in principle even be properly valued? If he cannot be compensated by some LTV calculation, how is he be compensated? Will he be compensated at all? What if he is compensated at a higher rate than workers or at a lower rate than workers? Who decides? This is not clear. History bears out what these theoretical predictions describe. We see historically in 3 test cases of the USA versus USSR, West Germany versus East Germany, North Korea versus South Korea, the socialist economies generally severely lagged behind their capitalist competitors. For example, during the Cold War, in nearly all cases, the USSR was 1 or 2 steps behind the US military and armaments innovation and 2 or 3 steps behind in consumer goods innovation. We can also see that in arguably proto-socialist society Sparta, innovation was stifled, and it was capitalist Athens that gave birth to the Western mind. Why is it that reactionary czarist Russia in its twilight had a galaxy of musicians, novelists, and philosophers, such as Tchaikovsky, Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy, and the USSR in its twilight had nothing I would offer that since these societies were not so narrowly circumscribed by the LTV, they could and did give appropriate value to these theories, the one with the greater to these artistic work, under the assumption that a theory must have explanatory power, and between any two theories, the one with the greater explanatory power is to be preferred. I argue the theoretical critique I offer of the LTV provides the greater explanatory power of these historical patterns and is on these grounds to be preferred. If the socialist would concede the point and say that the LTV does not explain intellectual works, then he must abandon his claim that the LTV is competent to explain all relevant facets of the political economy and that intellectuals can be exploited in any meaningful sense. Or he must use external theory to bootstrap the problem. This creates another issue. Is socialism enough? If the core economic assumption of socialism is not enough, then the socialist must appear to something outside of socialism to fix it. How is that then different than the neoliberals bootstrapping the problem of income inequality by post hoc taxation and redistribution? I would argue not at all. Socialists seem to have a dilemma. He must either accept the limitations of the LTV and abandon the idea that intellectuals can be exploited for their work, or the socialist must admit the LTV is not enough and fall into the neoliberal trap of post hoc bootstrapping. That's it.
You got it. Thank you very much, Todd, for that opening statement. And we will kick it over to Brenton for his as well. The floor is all yours, Brenton.
Thank you. So the topic tonight is, can socialism innovate? Which is just about the easiest slam dunk of a topic I can imagine. Because socialism is an economic and political system created by humans. And humans not only can innovate, but I would put forth the proposal that not innovating is actually harder for people than simply going with the flow and not coming up with the next new thing. For proof, you only have to look at human history and consider the wonders of arts, creativity, mechanics, science, and culture that have been produced by every group of humans performing every type of labor under the sun. I mean, the ancient Romans quite nearly invented the steam engine. In 50 CE, a mere 50 years after the birth of Christ, the aptly named hero of Alexandria designed and built a machine that functioned as a rotary engine. He used it to open doors and pump water, and even had plans sketched out for another contraption that used a design almost identical to modern steam turbine blades. He only had to put two and two together, and the ancient Romans could have been cruising around the Aegean in literal steamships. And that's just the Romans. Vikings and Polynesian sailors were crossing the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans respectively and discovering the very continent that we now find ourselves on 500 and 800 years before Europeans ever made the journey. The Chinese invented gunpowder in the year 900, and nearly a full 2,000 years ago, the sub-Saharan Africans were smelting metal tools and weapons in furnaces that were 752 degrees hotter than those produced by contemporary Romans. They had also already invented a rudimentary form of aspirin. The point is, if we are to appeal to something as spurious as human nature, and anyone who's ever read Emma Goldman knows that human nature is an extremely spurious thing to appeal to, it would seem that within human nature lies a propensity for creativity and innovation that crosses physical, cultural, and chronological borders with astounding regularity. And one can argue that man is at his most human when he or she is engaged in the act of creation. This type of behavior was even noticed and studied and remarked upon by Karl Marx himself, who wrote of this tendency as part of man's Gattungswesen, or species essence. In Estranged Labor, he writes, "It is true that animals also produce. They build nests and dwellings like the bee and the beaver, but animals only produce for their own immediate needs and those of their young, and only when immediate need compels them to do so. While man produces even when he is free from physical need, and truly produces only in freedom from such need, and also in accordance with the laws of beauty." Which is to say, that all of those who scoff at a possible socialist society and claim without the carrot and the stick of hypothetical wealth and all too real poverty, without this wholly necessary system of rewards and punishments administered by those in the pay of our own social elites, police, bureaucrats, managers, and jailers, who are empowered to act as gadfly to the great mass of men, without these people, we would inevitably stagnate and return either to living hand to mouth like the other species on this planet, or become so consumed by sloth that our whole civilization would soon collapse back into stupid savagery. Or worse, fall prey to another civilization who weren't so keen to spare the rod, nor so compassionate as to fail to empower an army of taskmasters to whip their own people into shape. This is certainly a compelling, if entirely self-serving fiction that our popular propaganda has advanced since at least the 18th century, and well before, in fact. Don't forget, it was the Catholic Church that made sloth a mortal sin, as if an order of priests were necessary to preach the virtues of labor into the peasantry, which you have to admit, by the way, is a really funny thought. A priest decked out in vestments sent by a man who spends his days making proclamations from a giant golden throne, preaching hellfire and damnation to all those who fail to appreciate the virtue of a hard day's labor. As if a priest or politician or CEO knows anything at all about hard work compared to a farmer or factory worker or Amazon employee. The point is, we as Westerners are laboring under a very pernicious delusion, and that delusion is that innovators are rare, and that the task of civilization is to find these magical people and elevate them to insane heights of privilege and power that they might continue to innovate. It's as if our society is on the lookout for geese that lay golden eggs, and when we can't find these geese, we just declare that the particular goose who happens to already be sitting on a giant pile of gold must have laid it themselves. And that's how we get people like Thomas Edison, Steve Jobs, and Elon Musk. All people who are renowned for possessing near supernatural reserves of brilliance, know-how, and work ethic, and yet in reality, none of these people are true innovators. Thomas Edison, arguably the best of the three, didn't even really invent the light bulb, and was more like a CEO who bought a building and filled it with other better inventors, and then just told them, innovate. And when these inventors did, he as their boss and the owner of the franchise took credit for their work. Steve Jobs pulled the same scam. When he unveiled the first iPhone in 2007, it didn't even work. The phone itself was primarily a product of taxpayer-subsidized government research, and his entire staff spent the whole day drunk and terrified that the non-working phone might crash and Jobs would ruin their careers over it. And let's not forget that Jobs himself was never a great genius, just a man lucky enough to have access to the labs at Xerox and all the technology contained within. And then we have Elon Musk, heralded as the real-world Tony Stark, whose most important and brilliant career move was to be born the son of a man who owned a literal emerald mine. And it was those emeralds, and not any particular genius, nor amount of hard work, nor great reserve of discipline, that put Musk into the position he is in today. You see, we have this idea that genius and creativity are exceptionally rare characteristics, and this is simply not the case. Rather, human creativity is broadly distributed among the species, but the opportunity to express and realize that creativity is not. This is borne out by the data. In a paper published by Professor Raj Chetty of Stanford University, which analyzed the backgrounds of patent holders in the United States, it was determined that the single greatest predictor of whether or not a child might go on to be an innovator was not the presence of talent, ingenuity, or drive, but how much money their parents made. The problem here is so bad that students with exceptional scores in childhood mathematics were no more likely to invent anything at all than the students with poor scores. That is, if only their parents were not among the highest income earners in the country. This data confirms exactly what paleontologist Stephen Gould famously wrote in 1980. I am somewhat less interested in the weight and convolutions of Einstein's brain than in the near certainty that people of equal talent have lived and died in cotton fields and sweatshops. This is to say that we humans are positively awash in geniuses, yet our society cannot recognize them because our current intelligence system relies on financial indicators of success in order to decide precisely which individuals shall have the privilege of making their will manifest, and throws roadblock after roadblock in the way of anyone who exists outside of this paradigm. What socialism will do, which can be broadly understood as an economic democratization of vital industries and resources, i.e. worker ownership within the context of an economy that is not beholden to the demands of profit and loss, which in simpler words, the whims of a tiny class of elites who earn their money not by the sweat of their brow, but by speculative monetary investments. Socialism will free millions, if not billions of humans from this economic bondage. And with their liberation, an ocean of creativity will be unleashed in the forms of artistic, cultural, and scientific achievements, the full extent of which, even in our current age of rapidly increasing technological wonders, will likely be unfathomable to us. The fact is that democracy, unlike monarchy and dictatorship, is grounded firmly in the principles of evolution. And as such, the more democratic and participatory we can make our intelligence system, the more each member of society will have the opportunity to bring their unique skills, talents, and perspective to the great collective social work of human society. The more fully we all benefit from their contributions. In short, socialism, as our next major economic and political system, will ensure that we won't have a single Albert Einstein, but instead thousands, if not millions of Einsteins, who are no longer constrained by the drudgery that is the current reality of being forced to work for the capitalists. And if this all seems too utopian for you, and you are perhaps still in the thrall of that nasty propaganda that I mentioned earlier, that equates our current lower classes with animals and beasts of burden, and fear that without the carrot and the lash, these people will challenges to overcome. This basic principle that was touched upon by Marx was proven later by Abraham Maslow and expressed in the popular imagination via his hierarchy of needs. It's not the socialists who's staring at humanity through rose-tinted glasses and imagining an impossible future that is a threat to innovation. Rather, it is those whose imagination has been stunted by this popular propaganda who tether humanity to the past. The fact is that we've been ready to run for a while now. Our species is, in fact, chomping at the bit to do so. But without a new liberatory way of doing things, we will forever remain lashed to the cart. And so what's most important here, with all of the problems that we face in the 21st century, is that we as a society find a way to get out of our own way. And the first step towards doing that is to transition to a socialist economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brenton. We will now kick it over to, for our last closing statement. Thanks, everybody. We're going to move into open discussion after this. This is from Keith. Thanks so much, Keith. The floor is all yours.
Well, when I was preparing my opening statement, I thought I would start by explaining what my actual views are. And after listening to the other opening statements, I think I was right to approach it in that direction, because while I don't really disagree with a whole lot I've heard so far, but I do think we probably have some disagreements on what socialism and capitalism actually are. And I also, just for the sake of interest, I want the listeners to know that they're not, that Brent and Ben are not debating Ben Shapiro here. So I do want to differentiate my views from those of, say, a free market conservative or a right libertarian or somebody like that. So I'll provide just a general overview of what my actual approach to political economy is. First of all, I reject any kind of singular determinism, but if I had to be some kind of determinist, I would be a political determinist, because I think the distribution of political power and military power and the power to engage in coercive violence generally precedes most other forms of social organization and most other features of social organization. Before you can have an economic system, you have to have a distribution of power in the wider society, and that's determined by a variety of factors. Another feature of economic life are the natural features like geography and topography and climate. There's also human capital, things like the level of health and education and things like that are found in a particular society. There's also the cultural values and the social norms of a society, which interact with economic actions and shape economic outcomes. Now, in terms of my wider view of human beings or what human society is, I generally, with some qualifications, agree with Hobbes or perhaps Machiavelli that society is largely a collection of conflicting groups and individuals that are pursuing their own interest, and that rent seeking is an inevitable feature of social life. Now, that's not to say that humans don't have a cooperative side as well, but that's hardly the sum total of what human beings are, what human beings do. I'm also a moral skeptic. My perspective is not about who is most moral, but I'm just simply interested in how do things work. For example, the idea of total equality may sound moral in theory, but does it work? Is it possible? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I also hold to power elite theory. I'm not a Marxist. I'm not a Keynesian, or those are the two dominant paradigms among liberal and left opinion. And then I'm not an Austrian economist or a neoclassical economist either. Those are the two dominant paradigms on the right. So I'm none of that. As I said, you're not debating Ben Shapiro here. What I do believe, though, is that the state, the ruling class, whatever you want to call it, are the full range of power elite institutions, not just the political government. The analogy I would make would be to the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, the ruling class was the church, the aristocracy, the royal dynasties and all of that, the military. And it's the same way in our modern societies. Instead of the royal families, we've got these political dynasties, the Bushes, the Clintons, the Trumps, whatever. Instead of feudal manners, we've got these mass corporations. Instead of the church, we've got the media and the universities, and we've still got the military. So not a whole lot has really changed in that regard. As far as major economic paradigms, I'm probably closer to the institutional economist, which is the idea that economic life is made up of individuals, firms, political institutions, social organizations, social norms, culture, all of these things interact with each other to make economic life what it is. And I think if you leave out any of those, you're running into problems. I also agree with the anarchist critique of the state and of concentrated power generally. My influences there would be historians and anthropologists like James Scott, Harold Barclay, David Graeber, Franz Oppenheimer, who pointed out that the historic role of the state in societies is to centralize control over wealth and property. So I hold to a somewhat similar critique of the relationship between state and capital that you find among individualist anarchists like, say, Benjamin Tucker, Lysander Spooner, maybe Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, maybe Henry George, figures similar to that within that tradition. I'll also concede that socialism, broadly defined, and I think socialism is a really broad concept, and I appreciate the efforts earlier to define it. I think there are some problems with the definition that was provided, but I would agree that socialism is not inherently statist in theory. That's a common argument that, say, conservatives and right libertarians make. But for example, there was an interesting essay written by Larry Gambone, a Canadian anarchist, about 15 years ago, where he described the different traditions within socialism and talked about how a lot of the classical 19th century socialists did not view their idea of socialism as some sort of state-run economy. Instead, they were more into communes and cooperatives and worker collectives and anarcho-syndicalist unions and things like that. Now, I do have a criticism of anarcho-communism. I think it's a product of time and place. I think it is derived from societies that were feudal agrarian economies that were based on subsistence production and peasant communal traditions. But before any anarcho-communists feel slighted, I also have the same problem with the deification of John Locke that you see in a lot of right libertarian and anarcho-capitalist thinking. I also think the Lockean approach to political economy is rooted in a specific time period. It's rooted in this early modern, early bourgeois, during the early phases of the market revolution, and reflects that kind of limited historical framework. I'll also acknowledge that communes can exist on a functional level. There's a place not far from where I live called Twin Oaks. Some friends of mine have lived there. Monasteries are certainly a type of commune that has existed for centuries in many different cultures. There's a place in Spain called Marina Lida. It's a kind of socialist leftist commune that seems to function very well. There's some sort of spiritualist commune in India called Auroraville. That's been there for decades and seems to work pretty well. I have a lot of anarchist friends that are fans of a novel called Bolo Bolo that kind of outlines this futuristic anarcho-communist society based on all these communes with all these strange identities that engage in exchange with each other. And I don't know that something like that is impossible in real life. But I do think scale is problematic. If we look at the work of Robin Dunbar, for example, we see the idea that once you start getting into a group that's, say, larger than 150 people, you start running into problems when it comes into cooperation because people are more collaborative with people they know. And we all know that from our personal lives. We tend to approach people we know and interact with on a person-to-person basis in a way that's much different than, say, when we're arguing with people on Facebook. I do think scale is a serious issue when it comes to things like communes and cooperatives and things of that nature. Now, I am probably the last person on earth who's going to be defending capitalism, or at least what is commonly called capitalism. There's a whole lot of problems with capitalism. The issues, first of all, are concentrated economic power, centralization of control over wealth and resources. I don't think capitalism, as at least as commonly understood, could exist without the state. I think that most conservatives and libertarians are not nearly thorough enough in their economic critique of the relationship between capitalism and the state. As I said earlier, I think corporations are the new modern, they're the modern feudal manorial system. And corporations play the same role in our society that the feudal manorial system did in the Middle Ages. I'm also not one of these property rights fundamentalists. Property rights to me is a social construct. It's like table manners. It's like different styles of dress, different styles of music. It's relative to time and place. I would also agree that non-state economies do not necessarily have to be market per se, and that economies generally do not have to be market-based. For example, the Incas had a non-market economy based on a system of exchange between productive units. And I think something like that could even be replicated in an anarchistic sense, like as a federation of monasteries or communes or something like that. But I do see some serious problems with quote unquote socialism as conventionally understood. Most people that I know who claim to be socialist, I think, hold to one of four basic ideas. One is utopianism, the idea of full communism, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. I don't, frankly, just don't see that working. There's always going to be rent seekers, as I said. There's also what's commonly called communism, Stalinism, Maoism, totalitarianism, the command economy. I don't think anyone on this panel is in favor of that, so I'll leave that to the side. Then there's social democracy, which to me is just capitalism plus the welfare state. Calling that socialism, I think, is problematic. And then there's democratic socialism, and based on what I know of Ben's work, I think this is probably his viewpoint, which is an expanded public sector with nationalized industries managed democratically and run by unions. I would submit that in a system like we have in the United States today, we have a system like that. We have there is an industry that is owned by the state, run on a nonprofit basis, and which is essentially controlled by unions, and that industry is called the police. And I'll just leave it at that for now.
Oops, I was on mute. So, folks, what I was saying there was thank you so much to our guests for their opening statements. We're going to jump into the open conversation right now. And so, as mentioned, if you happen to have any questions, feel free to fire them into the live chat, tagging me with @ModernDayDebate. And with that, thanks, gentlemen. The floor is all yours.
Yeah. So I did just want to real quick make one general comment, and then I was hoping we could go back to a couple of things that Todd said. The general comment is that I don't really think I heard any explanation of why socialism can't innovate in either of those opening statements. I heard some general thoughts about capitalism and socialism, but that seems to be slightly different. Then the specific thing is, so Todd made some historical claims that I thought were kind of odd. So, I don't think Sparta, there was certainly nothing socialist about Sparta, and there was also nothing capitalist about Athens. They were both slave societies. So I don't understand that part at all. And when it comes to these parallels about West Germany and East Germany and the US and the USSR and North Korea and South Korea, all of those seem to be relevant to a way of using the word socialism that I don't think either of us are using it in, as was mentioned earlier. But I also don't see what it has to do with any of the stuff about the labor theory of value. Because as far as I could tell, and please, Todd, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm getting you wrong, the claim is that somehow these societies were less successful because they were trying to compensate people for the amount of value that they created, understood in terms of the labor theory of value and socially necessary labor time, and that just didn't work as well. And I think that's just historically just flatly not true, that the Soviet Union or North Korea or East Germany ever claimed to be doing that. And it's also interesting to note that Karl Marx very explicitly didn't advocate that. It is true that he believed in the labor theory of value, just like lots of capitalists, pro-capitalist economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo believed in the labor theory of value. By the way, There are plenty of Marxists who are heterodox and reject that part of Marx. So G.A. Cohen, for example, has a paper, you can find it on the Verso website, called Labor Theory of Value and the Concept of Exploitation, where he argues, I think very convincingly to me, that the Marxist claim that workers are exploited is logically independent of whether you're a marginalist about value or you believe the labor theory of value or anything like that. That's just a separate issue. Regardless of what you think makes it the case that goods have the value that they do, that's a separate question from who has a right to distribute the surplus value that's created. And the objection is basically, to put it in all American terms, is the private sector version of taxation without representation in capitalist firms. But it's also just not the case that Karl Marx said that we should be compensating everybody for exactly as much, labor as they put in, understood in terms of socially necessary labor time. There was a faction in the German socialist movement that sort of said that, the Lassalleans, but if you read Marx's critique of the Gotha program, he criticizes them for saying just that, right? He says that in the early stages of socialist society, it might be necessary to tie compensation to how much people are putting in, with a whole bunch of caveats, but his reason for saying that is because it would be necessary for the sake of incentivizing labor. But he also says there's a strong sense in which this would be unjust, because some people are smarter than other people, some people are stronger than other people. So he said if you're rewarding people for how much they put in, it might be a necessary evil at some stage, but it's not. But you're just recreating a natural aristocracy because you're depriving some people based on things they can't control, like how smart they are and how strong they are. And final thought about this before Brenton gets in or the other team could respond, is just that, look, I certainly don't advocate, Brenton can speak for himself, but I certainly don't advocate that we make some sort of attempt to compensate people by calculating exact socially necessary labor hours or anything like that. I certainly don't think that I'm out of step with the socialist tradition in that. I think Marx says in Critique of the Gotha program that the Lassalleans are wrong to be obsessed with the question of how payment is distributed, because he says that's not the point of the socialist project. The point of the socialist project, the essence of it, the wildly unjust and unequal distribution we have under capitalism is just a system. The essential question is who controls the means of production, because they're the ones who decide how it's being distributed. So what I would say about how to distribute it is, look, I think we can have a fairly egalitarian state sector and worker cooperatives that actually exist. They don't have totally egalitarian pay scales, but they're way more egalitarian than regular capitalist firms, and that sounds good to me. And I just don't see how all the LTV stuff is relevant.
All right,
Well,
let's give,
can I try to clarify that
a good
point?
amount of time to Todd just to respond to as many points as possible.
Yeah, so let me first ask a question to make sure that we're on the same page and not talking past each other. I remember I was watching a video of yours a couple of days ago to sort of prepare for this debate, where you were discussing the theory of exploitation. And it sounded to me what you were saying was this: once we calculate the total cost of the product from the capital inputs in, and then the amount of cost of the labor of the worker, that's the total cost of the product. And then the capitalist then sort of dips into the value that the worker produced, and then adds that to his value to turn a profit, which is then what would be called exploitation. Is that a fair description of your thought on that?
It's not how I describe it, but as was just pointed out, I was just talking for a long time. So if you want to respond to other points before we go back to me, go right ahead.
Sure. So when we talk about the idea of the cost of the unit production of something, the SNLT says that we look at the average cost of these things by the average worker, by the average machine tool. And then we can get a rough estimate of what that should be valued at, or what that should be cost at any given time t in the economy based on these given factors. And so we could have a rough idea within a socialist system of what we ought to be valuing these things. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to say this is a one-to-one correlation. We might have other reasons to raise it or lower it, but that sort of puts it in a ballpark figure.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is, if that's where value is derived from, works that do not have average costs, where you can't look at a sector and see the average cost of it, it's only going to happen once. It's not clear how that can easily be accounted for in that theory.
So for the record, not what I think. I think that you can have any theory of value. You could be a marginalist about
Okay.
it, and the exploitation claim still stands. That they have a that workers are certainly creating the products that have value, and we could just bracket the question of where those products get their value. The workers create the products that have value, and therefore have a default right to control how that value is distributed, how much of it they take home, how much of it is spent on new production, etc. And I'm not convinced that capitalists, taking their cuts is legitimate. But that's a normative argument. It has nothing to do with average labor costs or anything like that.
Yeah,
Oh,
I'd
all
like
right.
to dovetail on that really quickly, by the way, Todd, because I was surprised to hear this, but about the LTV, but I hear this from capitalists a lot, and I think it's because they get really excited about supposedly LTV disproving exploitation. With looking into the marginalist revolution, because of these older critiques that some socialists are still kind of obsessed with. Because they're nerds, or because they lived at the time of Marx and Adam Smith. But the fact is that LTV versus subjective theory of value, I don't think it in any way gets to the heart of what people are complaining about, because let's say I'm not so much concerned of like what percentage of the workers' labor is being unfairly and unjustly appropriated by the capitalist, as I am the inherent relationship of being an employer and an employee is an inherently exploitative relationship that can never ever under a capitalist thing be equitable, because you have two parties bargaining from systems from unequal positions of power. And to a certain extent, to say to what Keith had said, you won't ever have perfect equality, but that doesn't stop you from trying to make things as equal and as even and as fair as possible, within the realm of what we can do in an average day as people in a flawed world. So the problem is more when you sign an employment contract with an employer, you are already being exploited, because you and the employer while you both stand to gain from that contract, the worker stands to gain far less from the contract than the employer does, and the employer risks far less by not signing that worker, because there's always another worker to sign. So, and the worst thing that can really happen to an employer is to lose their capital and become a worker. So when you have that kind of position where one party holds almost all the cards, unless workers do something like unionize or engage in direct action to increase their power against the employer, you will always have a contract that comes down unfairly and exploitatively on one of the parties. So I don't think, even if you did defeat LTV, and I'm not 100% sure that LTV has been completely defeated because it's mainly a philosophical point, I don't think that defeats socialism, and it definitely doesn't defeat exploitation theory. But again, I don't think that this means that we can't innovate. Again, people can innovate in any society. As I pointed out, the Romans nearly invented the steam engine. And then just really quickly on what you said, this is more of a personal thing, but you mentioned that so one of the problems that I noticed in your criticism of entertainment was that the tacit assumption that an entertainer, an artist like myself, has to appeal to the largest audience possible, and that this creates tension like within the work. And it does when the work is for profit in a capitalist economy, when art is not art, but art is a product. But the fact is that an artist like myself doesn't have to appeal to everyone in the world. My work, I would love it if a lot of people really like my work, but ultimately I just need enough people to locate my work, identify with it, and help to support me so that I can continue to do it. That's really all I need. I don't need everything that I produce to be the next Marvel movie, for instance. It is the will to efficiency and the drive to use art for profit. That's what creates the tension. So these tensions would not be present in a socialist society. And even if you look at socialist, and there's been incredible socialist art that's been coming out over the centuries, but even in the Soviet Union, you did have some incredible innovations. I'm not going to defend the Soviet Union because I think that there's a lot that's wrong with that model. But just even with that model, which I think is probably one of the worst attempts at socialism that we've had, you've got incredible artists like Shostakovich coming out. And granted, Shostakovich did bristle against the Soviet government, and some of his most beautiful work was done after he was forced to join the Communist Party. But at the same time, that's sort of the artist's job. We're supposed to bristle at the society around us because we are supposed to stand outside of society and to provide an insight that may not be visible to those who are in the pale. That's why we are beyond the pale. So, I mean, you've got Shostakovich. You also have Soviet cinema, which was they pioneered the jump cut. There are a number of really incredible innovations that came even from this, what I would argue again, poor example of socialism, that just really is mind-blowing. The whole fact that we went to the moon, like the Americans never would have gone to the moon without the Russians shooting a dog into space. And why did the Russians shoot a dog into space? Because they weren't concerned about profit, because they were looking to do something to advance science and to make their mark in a way that did not directly lead to making profits for an investor class. And then, of course, the Americans, we just had to outdo them at it because we're jerks. But the point being is that without that first part of the dialectic, without the Soviet space program, the American space program would have never happened until there was a market incentive to do it. And there's still not a market incentive to go to space today.
And I would just to put a little bow on something Brett just said. I mean, if you're worried about excessive artistic populism, about artists having to appeal too much to the majority of the population, then which is a problem that you might still have under certain forms of socialism, but it's damn sure a problem you have under capitalism. And if you want to avoid that, then what you want is to find ways to de-link compensation for artists from market forces. And I would suggest that even within the United States, some New Deal programs, did that quite effectively. Certainly in the Soviet case, and certainly in principle, you could have, as part of a society with a vastly beefed up, public sector, you could have a vastly beefed up level of state support for the arts. We could argue about whether socialism is necessary or sufficient to get that, but it's certainly not something that's like it's certainly not obvious how the transition from capitalism to socialism is supposed to increase the problem of artistic populism rather than decrease it.
Yeah,
Can I add?
Jackson, real quick, because I want to make this point before I forget. Let's not forget that Jackson Pollock, one of those famous American painters.
Just to be fair, that I think it might have been Brenton and then Ben and then Brenton, and so just to be sure that they have plenty of time to respond.
Sure. Can I just get this out real quick? Just to put this on here.
As long as we give the same amount of time back to them.
That's fine. We can give it back to them. But what I really want to make clear here is that Jackson Pollock, one of the most famous American painters, his work was directly supported by the CIA as a weapon against the Soviets. Like, there were freaking suits coming in there. They didn't care about Jackson Pollock's art. What they wanted to do was they wanted to use his art as propaganda to show, look how free and innovative the West is. So they threw, thousands and thousands of dollars at him and other artists, which ironically, the same people that were paranoid about the Soviets and also hated Jackson Pollock and hated his art and didn't want the government spending money on it. And they had to go back and spend it in secret.
All right. So first of all, neither Keith nor I are advocating for the current state of capitalism, or that the current state of capitalism would necessarily make any one of these things better or worse. So we can just dispense with that because neither one of us are arguing for that. Now, with regards to the artistic angle, and this is definitely going to be more of a discussion more towards Brent's way, when you look at a democratic decision-making process, when you then have to divvy up the resources in order to, so there's at least two reasons why I think theoretically you would see a more populist shift in art under a socialist society. One is when you have to appeal to whatever body is organized to distribute the resources amongst the community, where you get your cut. For those people who are producing tangible physical goods, it's going to be a lot easier for them to justify their cut. I'm growing your fruit, I'm baking your bread, I'm making your clothes. You don't have to try as hard to sell the fact that you're going to need that cut of the public stock to do your job. If you want to do art, it's not as immediately intuitive to people. That doesn't mean you can't make your case, but in order to make your case, in order to get an access to the public fund, one of the things you're going to have to do is in any democratic society, you're going to have to appeal to as many people as possible in order to support your purpose, your agenda on this. And I think what that is going to lead to over time is a populist pull, which will lead to, as I think, a diseconomy of scale, where you have to make too many people happy to get the resources you need to make the product. Now that's getting the resources for you to make the product. And then depending on how popular you want it to be, because artists, some artists like Tolkien, don't care if they're popular or not. That's true, but there are those that do. And for those that do, I think they're going to be not only incentivized to be more such that way, they're going to be selected for, because they're going to have a way of thinking that is more consistent with a democratic process. If somebody's very brooding and isolated, like a Tolkien, he might be viewed as someone who's not sufficiently participatory in the democracy and might not be popular. And it might be hard for him to swing a vote for resources to be allocated to him to do socialistic art. Whereas if somebody is more interested in being popular with other people, there's also that pressure to then put as much in there to make these people happy. And I think that is with that, and because you have to have all these different factors, all these different elements of the society, at least a 51% majority on your side to get the resources transferred over, at least on a reliable basis, there's going to be a trend and a pull in that direction. Whereas if you have one class to worry about, and it doesn't have to be a capitalist class, it is many different classes throughout history, it makes that easier in the sense that you only have to worry about one group of people, and you can refine your work to that group of people. And over time, you can have a deeper tradition. So as I mentioned, in the ancient world, we had, the Iliad, the Aeneid, and the Odyssey, all of which were written for basically the same class interest. And we do see that because it's the same class interest, we have a coherence and a tightness, and these are classic works that are still studied today. We don't, one could argue hypothetically the socialist democratic experiment hasn't been around long enough to try, maybe. But, Reformation England within 70 years produced Shakespeare. So, I also don't know how long we're supposed to wait. But I don't want to make a historical argument per se. I'd prefer to make a theoretical one. And the theoretical argument that I'm making is that the pressures of a democratic society would tend to pull the creators. So the idea that the creator wants to just do what they want to do, and then there's, these external pressures that pull them away under capitalism. Sure, I will concede that point. But what I will say though is I do think there's a tension that isn't maybe fully aware, maybe fully cognizant in many socialists, that there would be another tension pulling people away from just a pure act of creativity, that they would have to worry about these other interest groups that want to have a stake in what they're producing, because in part they're subsidizing it by the total value they're producing in a socialist economy. And I think Keith, unless you have anything to say, I'd like to toss it back to Brent.
Well, I would like to respond to something that Ben said in response to us, which is that we really didn't get into this question of innovation, like how is socialism incompatible with innovation? A problem I have with a lot of what I'm hearing so far is it doesn't really sound like anyone's talking about socialism, at least not as I would understand socialism. I hear a lot of discussion of either modified capitalism or social democracy or anarchism being discussed. But I don't know that that's really what socialism is, viewed in a proper historical context. I would concede that certainly, as I said before, real life cooperatives can exist. Mondragon is a good example. I'd say an even better example is the Emilia Romagna, which is in Italy. And I'm not in favor of giant hierarchical organizations or narrow concentrations of power or a narrow concentration over investment decisions like we have in our current system. I like the idea of, say, stakeholder partnerships and decentralization and diversification of participation and investment decision-making processes. But the problem I see is that capital markets are still necessary for innovation because innovation requires investment, which means that resources have to be transferred from elsewhere to invest in new products, new technologies, labor costs, et cetera. An example would be healthcare. Healthcare is capital intensive because of the cost of the advanced technology that's involved. It's also labor intensive because it requires lots of workers and lots of highly skilled workers. And it's also got a very high level of consumer demand because everyone needs healthcare. And that's one of the primary reasons why healthcare is so expensive. It's not the only reason by any means, but it is a major contributing factor. Socialism, as I have always understood it in the 35 years I've been studying it, is based on the idea that we're eliminating the market. Instead, what we're doing is we're engaged in subsistence production for the meeting of human needs rather than the production of profit. That is, we have a subsistence-based planned economy. We determine, we seek to
socialist for my whole adult life, and I've never met anybody who advocates subsistence level production.
Let me finish my point.
It still would be democracy because you wouldn't have a capitalist class.
Oh, all right. Just hear plenty from Keith and Todd.
Okay. Well, the idea behind socialism, as I understand it, is that we produce to meet human needs. It's not just to make profit. Capitalism is the idea that you produce things to sell on the market to generate profit, and then you use your profit to invest in new production to produce more profit. That's capitalism. Socialism is, okay, we want to rationalize production. We want to rationalize it where, okay, we need housing for everyone. We need healthcare for everyone. We need food for everyone. And how are we going to get that? So we want to allocate resources in this kind of rationalistic planned economy. The problem, when I say subsistence, I'm not talking about subsistence of, well, we're just going to produce enough to keep from starving to death, and that's all. I've never met a Marxist, as Ben said, I've never met a Marxist who believes that. All right, but it's still subsistence production in the sense of you're producing to meet need rather than to produce for profit. I think that's what I mean by subsistence. The problem with that, though, is that you don't necessarily have a surplus to invest in innovation. And I think even more seriously, you don't really have mechanisms for exchange that result in the division of labor, which makes the specialization that's necessary for innovation possible. Now, it's possible to certainly change the definition of, say, property rights. For example, usufructuary rights instead of the homesteading principle, or Henry George's, land tenure theory, or whatever. Or you could also change the structure of production. You could have cooperatives, communes, collectives, clubs, unions, workers' councils, whatever. You could have those instead of conventional capitalist companies or even petty bourgeois firms. Or you could shift control of production from capitalist corporations directly to the state. But I don't think that it eliminates any of these problems. Now, another issue is socialism, as I understand it, is about trying to eliminate the law of value. And that gets back to the issue that I was talking about earlier about subsistence production as opposed to production for profit. All right, now, some years ago, I heard a lecture by Mike Parenti, a leading Marxist scholar. He's probably fairly old by now, probably 80-something, 90-something. But he observed that all modern socialist regimes had more or less the same model of society. It was the one-party state, the command economy, the planned economy, and mentioned not only the quote-unquote communist countries were like that, but most socialist countries were like that. Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe was like that. So a lot of economies that didn't identify specifically with, the Marxist-Leninist paradigm still had a similar political and economic model. And Parenti suggested that there was a reason for this, and that is, it's what's most workable in that kind of contextual sense, because in order to have an economy,
just to pardon my interruption, just to, because we'll pretty quick we'll go into the Q&A. And so what we might need to do is once we hear from the no position team in terms of wrapping this portion up, we might have to go to kind of our last kind of little responses before we go into the Q&A. Just want to give you a heads up, just because we had a little bit of a late start and we don't want to go too far over our time.
I only have about one more sentence.
Gotcha.
In order to have an economy where the law of value is eliminated, you end up with a rationing system like what they had in the Soviet system. And to have a system like that, you have to have a maximum amount of social and labor discipline. And that's how you get a military model of labor organization and production, like you do and have in these kinds of Marxist-Leninist command economies. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah,
I'll point something out very, very obviously. There's a reason why a lot of states that were supported financially and militarily by the USSR took on aspects of the political structure of the USSR, and that's because the USSR was arming them.
And I'd also say this idea that Robert Mugabe, if there's anything socialist by any definition about Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe, is extremely odd. It's not only, it's not like there's no most people in that country work for regular capitalist employers. I mean, you certainly can't say social democracy isn't socialism without saying that's not socialism. And again, what's being advocated here, there's a very clear definition that we started with at the beginning of the debate of socialism. And what's being advocated is not social democracy, even if you have, and there are several decades at this point of branches of socialist theory that advocate some form of market socialism, or think you'd have to at least start out with some form of market socialism. But what makes it socialism and not just social democracy is that you don't still have a separate capitalist class owning the means of production. Two really quick things I wanted to say are, one, just to go back to think about artistic creativity. Todd gave us a sort of a priori speculative reason to think that you'd have more artistic populism under socialism. But if you look at actually existing state support for the arts, as conservatives are constantly complaining about, it goes in the opposite direction. That's what enables art that often offends mass taste, is delinking it from the market and having something like the National Endowment for the Arts that has its own procedures for giving it out that don't depend on popularity. I think under socialism, you'd have much more of that. I also want to go back to an important claim that Keith made at the end of his opening statement, which is that like police abuses say something negative about democratic socialism because the police are publicly owned and because it's unionized. And I'd say that of course, sure, we could pick out the police. We could also pick out Medicare. We could pick out lots of other actually existing publicly owned things staffed by unionized workers that the left is rightly, big fans of. But the problem with the police is that the communities they police have too little control over them, not too much. And so the one thing that's worse than publicly owned police is privately owned police who are accountable, not even in the totally inadequate way that existing police are to the communities that they police, but not at all to those communities. They're accountable to the people who sign their paychecks. And the last point I make is I still haven't heard a reason that socialism can't innovate.
Yeah. As much as I want to really jump down the theoretical artist hole, that's my jam. And Todd, maybe you and I can have a conversation about that. I think what I wanted to point out about first off, the way in which resources are distributed within a socialist society does not have to be, there could be any number of ways to distribute those resources, whether you're using market socialism or you're using a GA model, which, by the way, you don't need a 51% ruling majority to make decisions within a GA model. It's actually a very, it's a very diverse way of handling problems where you can even have a very small but very vocal minority that is still able to get its way within a consensus-based system. So I think that what's happening here is socialism is being very narrowly defined. It's being very narrowly defined in a way that I don't see reflected in modern socialist movements. I don't hear a lot of arguments about LTV, for instance, being correct coming from socialists. You just don't hear that. Similarly, again, like with the Robert Mugabe, that I've never ever heard, like even the worst tanky, I've never heard anyone defend Mugabe. Like the person who, yeah, okay, fair enough, but yeah, you got some weird people clustered around you. But like, so I think overall, what's important here to understand is like the type of socialism that Ben and I are arguing for is more about, one, who controls economic production, who actually controls it, and how does it function? There's been a lot has been said about not having profit, but it's very important to understand, like in an economic context, not having profit does not mean that you don't have a surplus. It means that you are a lack of profit in an economic sense is a lack of money that is in that surplus that has been earmarked to be sent to a class of investors. Nonprofits can make a ton of money. And I'm not saying we build a thing of nonprofits. Nonprofits can make way more money that they put out than they take in. The difference between a nonprofit and a for-profit corporation within the United States right now is that the nonprofit does not hand that profit over to a board of directors. Rather, they take that money and they, one, give it to their employees, and two, use it to invest and continue in the work that they are doing. So in a nonprofit-driven economy, you can still have organizations, assuming we're still using money, that take in a huge surplus because what they're doing is something people really identify with and want to see more of. And they can then take that money and roll it over into more of their work and into more innovation. So a lack of profit does not stifle innovation. And in fact, I would go as far as to say that profit-seeking behavior itself stifles innovation, because good is always going to get about the same rewards as great. And at the same time, it's going to cost a lot less. There's only so good of a sandwich someone can make. So a mind-blowing sandwich will probably cost about the same as a okay sandwich. So I'm going to say overall, I don't think a lack of profit is going to be what's going to stifle innovation within a socialist society.
So Keith and Todd, we can give you each a quick response back, and then what we'll do is go into the Q&A. So Keith and Todd, the floor is yours.
Okay, Keith, why don't you go first?
Okay. Well, I could say a lot of things in response to what's been said. And once again, I think a lot of it comes down to terminology, because we seem to have different conceptions of what socialism is. But I think I would go a bit further, though, and start and offer some other social science insights, because the problem that I see with any kind of system, whether you call it socialist or capitalist or whatever, is, first of all, the idea behind democratic socialism, as I understand it, at least, is that you've got mass democracy. You know, it's the people's state, it's the people's economy, and all of these kinds of things. The workplaces are democratic. Something like, I suppose something like Walmart would be nationalized and put under workers' control with some sort of democratic council or something like that. I mean, I'm familiar with some of these theories, but I think that some other issues come into play that I don't really hear being addressed by most socialists. And that is, one of them is the 80-20 principle. The social scientist, Wilfredo Pareto, had the idea that in any kind of organization, about 20% of the people who in the organization do about 80% of the work necessary to sustain the organization, and that 20% of the members of an organization tend to dominate the organization. There's also Michael's insight about the iron law of oligarchy, that organizations tend to become oligarchies the larger they become, and the bigger your organization, the more oligarchical it's going to be. There's also Mosca's insights about the circulation of elites, that in institutions, you see people who are elites in one institution circulating as elites in other institutions. There's also the role of culture, social norms, ideological superstructure, and the ways in which those shape economic life. I mean, Marx recognized that. Sorel, some other socialists recognize that. There's also the question of regulatory capture. That's a major problem when you start talking about state-run industries and things like that. There are critics of that that go all the way back to the progressive era, like Charles Beard and thinkers like that. There's also the question of the role of the state in society. I mean, to me, I agree with Weber's definition of the state. The state is an institution that exists to have a monopoly on violence, and the state as a bureaucracy that takes on an institutional life of its own, that has its own institutional interests, aside from that of whatever its official purpose may be. There's also the insights of public choice theory, which indicate that democracy, is an oligopoly of special interest groups, and we certainly see that in our public democracy today. And even the most perfectly conceived democracy is still a tyranny of the majority, as John Stuart Mill pointed out. The idea of mass democracy is something that I would say I would approach with reservations, because I don't know that mob rule is any better than elite rule. Now we're getting into some other issues that are beyond the question of socialism.
Say elite rule is considerably worse than mob rule. What's very interesting about
what we might be able to do, this might be an opportunity, because we did want to go into the Q&A pretty quick here, and so Todd hasn't gotten a chance to respond. Todd, if you have anything, this might be a great opportunity.
Yeah.
And then we'll jump into the Q&A.
Yeah, sure. So again, we don't have a lot of time left, but as far as the broader democratic decision-making issues, any kind of innovation of this kind is going to entail a great amount of risk, and groups are generally risk averse, in part because it's not clear necessarily who is the one taking the risk, and then who is the one that is going to bear the cost of the risk should the risk fail, and but also who is going to benefit from making the decision if the risk were to be successful. Which is why, again, with venture capitalists, these are very small groups and with very clearly defined who's risking what, who's at fault if the risk fails. Now, does that mean there isn't some other way you could do it? Possibly. There's possibly some other way, but it's not clear how through this more robust democratic decision-making process you would see that. And the other problem is, at least as I see with socialists on the internet, a lot of times they'll sound like they all sort of have an underlying agreement on what socialism is, at least when they're talking to non-socialists. But then in private, they get into all these debates about what socialism actually is. And so then when they make these decisions, they're thinking, oh, well, everybody is agreeing with my definition of socialism. But then what we see is that, no, they actually don't. And when it enters into a revolutionary phase, you get into all of the circular firing squad of something like the Russian Revolution, or the Mensheviks and the left SRs and the Bolsheviks. Say in 1916, they're like, oh yeah, we all have the same definition of socialism. But then as they gain more and more power and they're not defining themselves against some other group, then it becomes clear that what they all thought was socialism was different, and that they were actually in fact incompatible with one another. And so a lot of these problems converge, and so then we have a difficulty of taking risky ventures. Now, if it turns out that it is the case such that these works are risky and groups are risk averse, unless some intentional method that I've not seen provided is produced, then we're not likely going to see such innovation. And with regards to,
maybe the
again,
final
the democratic,
point.
one more point. Okay, well then with regards to the artistic creativity, let's compare like with like. So the end of Tsarist Russia, I mean, it's kaput, right? Right before the revolution, there's not much left. But from like 1880 to like 1913, we have a galaxy of musicians, authors, novelists, playwrights. We still read Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. Who do we read from Soviet Russia from 1970 and 80? There does seem to be a disconnect between the artistic creativity of even a late stage feudal society, or maybe a proto-capitalist society, and then a late stage socialist one.
Thank you very much. We are going to jump into the questions. And so want to remind you folks, by the way, if you did not know it, Modern Day Debate is on podcast. We're really excited about that. So pull out your phone, see if you can find us on your favorite podcast app. And want to let you know as well, if you're listening via podcast, we also put the speakers links in the description box for the podcast. So you can reach the speakers either in the description box of the podcast app or here on YouTube, where you can also find their links at the very top of the description, folks. So with that, we are going to jump into these questions. Want to say thanks everybody for your questions. We're going to move relatively quickly as we started a bit late, so we're going to try to move fast just to respect the speaker's time. So Sunflower says, Brenton, when basics are taken care of, people seek new heights and masteries. Not true for the majority of welfare recipients. Can we get a citation?
What do you mean not true for the majority of welfare? Again, this is like established psychological fact. If somebody within who is like receiving welfare is not reaching new heights, the only way, how are you even calculating that? What do you know that they're doing with their time? They may not be functioning within the market because they've been disincentivized to, but at the same time, they may be writing the next great novel. They may be the next Tolstoy. We just haven't noticed it yet. Or they may already be the next Tolstoy, but we'll never see their work because they were not within a class that is economically privileged enough to get themselves into a position to publish their novel.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. And thank you for your question from Sphincter of Doom. Says, the question should not be whether socialism can innovate. The question should be whether capitalism or socialism fosters more innovation.
That'd be an interesting debate if it wasn't the one we had tonight. But.
A juicy one indeed. And thanks so much for your super chat coming in from Will Stewart right now. Will ask Dr. Ben if, let's see. Hold on a second. There it is. Okay. Thanks for your patience. Said, if socialism is anti-coercion / anti-exploitation, how do you establish it if even one person refuses without using coercion?
Well, if the idea is that it's opposed to all coercion, then yeah, that would be a big problem. That you can't have any social or economic system where there's no coercion whatsoever. You would have what Matt Brunig calls the grab what you can world, where you wouldn't have any property rights and everybody could just use everything at any time. That somebody could, who wanted to, would be allowed to come into my home and use my toothbrush at will. Without, because if you're not going to have some coercion about distribution of resources, then you probably couldn't have an economic functioning society at all. I don't have any sort of absolutist anti-coercion position. I don't know when I advocated that. I think that I would, however, like the decisions about the uses of resources that we coercively enforce, as you would have to in any possible society, even an anarcho-capitalist one. I would, however, like those decisions to be democratically decided. If you remember when I was talking about exploitation earlier, the analogy I made was to taxation without representation, which isn't a complaint about the existence of taxation, it's a complaint about the lack of representation.
Gotcha.
Anti-coercion tends to be like more an ANCAP and a right libertarian way of speaking. Left anarchists will also talk about it, like left libertarians, but I would say overall, Ben is 100% right. Even if you are coming from an anti-coercive thing, it's not about a perfect solution. It's about building the least coercive society that is reasonably possible right now.
Gotcha. And Andrew Olson, thanks for your question, said, if I'm a worker cog in a socialist, my only goal is cog an abbreviation for something?
No, I think he's just
saying it's like a little piece of a machine.
Oh, I see. I gotcha. So if I'm a worker cog in a socialist, I think they mean like country or society. My only goal is to produce a quota and I'll quote get paid. Why then would anyone do extra work and endanger themselves in experiments for no gain? Enjoying the convo.
Well, I mean, I think this gets back to something that I have to say I found a little bit frustrating this discussion, which is that, all right, broadly speaking, socialism refers to any sort of proposal for social ownership of the means of production, but we started out by giving a very specific model of what a social society could look like and asking, given that, all of the elements of this model have been beta tested in the real world, and all the elements of this model do in fact involve innovation in the real world, why is it that putting them together in this way wouldn't involve innovation? And I haven't heard that. Instead, what I keep hearing is going back to the question of the Soviet model, which nobody here advocates, and this reference to quotas seems to be a reference to that. And all I could say is that you got the wrong address. Got to deliver that package elsewhere.
I would say to this one, this is yet another case of capitalists attacking socialism by describing capitalism again. Like, you've basically described living in a capitalist society and working within like a low wage job within a corporation where you have no motivation to do extra. You just need the paycheck. So I don't think this has anything to do with capitalism or innovation. I just think it's a rhetorical point that people love to trot out.
Gotcha. And Big Thang, Bruce Wayne, thanks for your question, said Alaskan Americans own the rights to the minerals beneath their feet. They get a form of UBI and have for decades. Why not expand this to the rest of America? I think that would be for you, Keith and Todd.
Well, I don't know that I would be opposed to expanding that to the rest of America. In fact, I know it was when Sarah Palin was running for whatever she ran for, vice president or whatever. I remember joking with someone, a Republican friend, who was talking about, what he hoped the Obama didn't win because he was a socialist. And I said, oh no, Sarah Palin is probably more of a socialist than Obama, so you've got nothing to worry about. But no, I don't have a problem with something like that per se. I don't know that I'd call that socialism. It's not something I find inherently objectionable.
It wouldn't add up to socialism by itself, but public ownership of the oil industry would be a nice start.
They did that in Norway, actually, and their entire oil industry is nationalized, and then they weren't attacked by the United States because they're white. And what wound up happening was that now everyone in Norway has the equivalent of like a $200,000 trust fund through their public ownership of the oil, and as a result, they have one of the best standards of living in the world. So that's not necessarily socialism, but it's definitely a step in the right direction.
Gotcha. And Colorado Biker Prepper says, for the panel, so I think for each side, what about the conflation between communism and socialism?
I mean, I think both of those terms have been used in lots of different ways historically. What somebody like Karl Marx or Frederick Engels, or for that matter, anarchists like Emma Goldman meant by communism is pretty close in a lot of ways to what I think Brent and I mean by democratic socialism. And of course, lots of societies that had models that I wouldn't agree with at all have use the word socialism or use them interchangeably or whatever. So, I mean, I wouldn't get too hung up on labels. The question is, what do those labels signify? And if what's being signified is the Soviet model of a undemocratic command economy, then all I could say is that's not what that's not what I advocate. If what's being signaled is some form of workers' control of the means of production, then yeah, that's what I advocate. I don't really care what we call it. Workers' control by any other name is just as sweet.
I love that you quoted Shakespeare there. All right, so it's like I would consider myself a small c, anarcho-communist, or at least that's what I'm most interested in. I'm also interested in aspects of democratic socialism. The distinction between socialism and communism to me is that socialism is worker ownership over the means of production within an economy that is decoupled from the laws of profit and loss. It's an economy that's not functioning primarily to bring profits to an investor class. Communism is a classless, stateless, moneyless society in which the means of existence are collectively owned by everyone within that society and operated and controlled by the workers who physically possess them. Communism is an end stage ideal goal, which may or may not be possible, although I do think it's important to shoot for the moon, land in the stars. Whereas socialism is a means of organizing the economy. Neither of these, you'll notice, have anything to do with what has been called, I will call it capital C communism, which is the sort of authoritarian, Marx-Leninist, really Stalinist version that we saw at the USSR or in North Korea. And heck, I'd call North Korea not communist, but an absolute monarchy.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
I'd also
Next.
just real quickly say that before I forget about this, that the division between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks had nothing to do with how to define socialism. It's that the Mensheviks thought that Russia needed a two-stage revolution, and all it was ready for was a capitalist democratic one at that point, not a socialist one. And the Bolsheviks ultimately, had a different position, not really relevant to anything. I'm just going to neurotically,
Gotcha. Thanks so much. And then White Neat says the idea that we wouldn't work / innovate unless it's for wealth is true in this political economy because of alienation. Why treat alienation like an objective feature of human nature?
I know what he's talking about, but I want to give other people a chance to.
Well, I think that's a question for Keith and I. Well, certainly in the case of alienation, you could argue that is the case now, but I don't think one would have to assume. What I would object to is the idea that you have to assume alienation is the only reason why people wouldn't perform in this particular way we're talking about if they weren't paid in money. One, Keith and I aren't arguing that they have to be paid in money. They could be compensated some other way. So, for example, the Austrian Catholic monk Gregor Mendel invented modern genetics. I don't think he was paid to do that, but he had other motivations that were sufficient to motivate him to experiment with peas. But I do think we could. What I would object to is that if you say that the only reason why people wouldn't work if they had everything taken care of was because they were alienated in the capitalist economy, I don't think that's the only condition under which they wouldn't do these things if they had other material needs taken care of. For example, we can think of the spoiled aristocratic child who never has to worry about anything in his life, but because of that, he just has this sort of hedonistic, careless attitude towards life because he's never had to work. So, and in his case, it's not because he's alienated from his labor by capitalism. One could argue it's precisely because he's been privileged in that way that he's this spoiled aristocratic kid. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Keith?
Well, the problem I have with that question is that I think it's rooted in a problem that I pointed out in my introduction, which is economic determinism. I think that when it comes to the question of whether somebody's motivated to work, produce, or innovate, or whatever, there's also the issue of the individual's personality structure and all of the different things that make that what it is, and economic conditions are only one of many aspects of that. I know people that I have no doubt that if you gave them, say, a UBI of $50,000 a year, they would do absolutely nothing. They'd sit in front of the TV and smoke pot for the rest of their life. I know other people that you could give them $1 million a year as a UBI, and they would still be out busting ass, working, doing something, inventing this or being an entrepreneur or whatever, or some kind of work. Maybe it wouldn't even be profit-generating work; it would be civic work or something like that. They would be doing that. So the issue there, I think, gets more into issues of personality structure, psychological makeup, as much as economic systems. Not that to say that economic systems don't intersect with individual personalities, but it's a lot more complicated than what the question would suggest.
You got it. Thanks so much. And Will Stewart, thanks for your question. Forgive me, guys. It's I didn't get a great night of sleep last night. Did I already ask this one? That Dr. Ben, what is your definition of democracy? In a pure democracy, how do you safeguard the majority from exploiting the minority?
Yeah, so I think my definition of democracy would be the same as everybody else's. Rule by the majority. Now, if you're worried about having the minority rights being trampled on in a pure democracy, that might give you a reason to want an impure democracy, with some constitutional protection for minority rights. But I don't see how it gives you a reason to not want democracy or crucially, how it gives you a reason to not want democracy extended into the sphere where most adults have to spend the best 8 hours of every 5 days a week, and it's only 8 hours because the result of past worker struggles.
You got it.
If I could just add a little PS onto this, because I was starting to talk about this earlier. I find oftentimes in critiques of democracy, they'll say stuff like, democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting about what's for dinner, and they'll put these huge fears of like mob rule. The fact is that when you are making a decision democratically, you can have a tiny group of people make that decision, and you can have a large group of people make that decision. And maybe it'll be a great decision. Maybe people will get screwed over by it. But if it's a large group of people making that decision, you have a much better chance of being part of that large group and not getting screwed over than if there's a small group. Essentially, to favor elite democracy over direct democracy or more universal forms of democracy is essentially just the wish for a benevolent dictatorship to be extended. It's inherently anti-democratic. So I think what people really need to realize when someone's stoking those fears is, why are they stoking those fears? And the fact is, they're doing it to make you afraid of your own power. Everyone is an individual, and every individual is part of a collective. There isn't actually a battle to be waged there.
You got it. And thanks, Christopher Hatch. Appreciate your question. And also your spelling of subsidies. That's is really clever. So they asked, are wage subsidies like food stamps socialist?
No.
Yeah, no.
Gotcha. Everybody's on the same page, it sounds like. And then thanks for your question. This one coming in from, I think we had asked, yep, got that. Brad Morberg, thanks for your question, said, I like the idea of central planning, but how can we make sure social liberties are protected under a government that has the power of central planning?
We can.
That just sounds like the democracy question worded slightly differently. And even if you do have, so I think that the idea that having the economy be in the hands of private owners is some sort of safeguard against trampling of liberties is just kind of historically illiterate, because whereas it's true that there are authoritarian countries that have had centrally planned economies that have trampled over those, it's also true that there have been authoritarian countries that have had regular capitalist economies that have had just as much trampling of those liberties, or much more so. When you talk about like Hitler and Suharto and people like that, which again happened in societies that where most of the economy was in the hands of regular capitalist companies. So I'd say that if that's your plan for safeguarding, social liberties, is to keep the economy private, I think you need a better plan.
Yeah, I'd say that there is something of there is some sort of a steel man that I can pull out of this, in that it is generally a bad idea to centralize power and control of like over the entire economy and lots of factors of society in the hands of just a few people, because it's easier to get a idiot in that position. It's easier to get a tyrant in that position. And it's easier to just make a mistake and cause more problems. We want power to be diffused as much as possible, because then there's more fail-safes that will prevent those kinds of problems. And we see in countries with more democracy, they tend to be a little bit more robust and able to handle economic crises and also political crises because of that state of diffused power. What I'm going to say is that with regard to capitalism and socialism, I think socialism will diffuse the power more rather than more greatly concentrated in the form of the state.
You got it. And this one, fresh in from Will Stewart, appreciate it, said, Brenton, is 6 million years of human evolution not empirical evidence of that fear?
Of what fear?
Yeah, I was wondering that. I was hoping you'd know. Okay, let me
I think he might be referring to something I said in my opening statement, where I talked about like the fear that people will, if we're not whipped into shape, if we're not forced to produce, will either be conquered or will stagnate. And I would say human evolution is the reason why that won't happen. I mean, capitalists talk all the time about us having infinite wants and infinite needs, and the Buddhists know this, that desire is something that you can't conquer by gaining things, either by accomplishments or by physical acts or pulling power to yourself. As soon as you have what you want something else. So the fact is that human psychology does not allow us to stagnate, and it's one of the things that separates us from the animals. The problem here is that he's thinking of humans as if we are animals, because I'm guessing that the propaganda he's ingested has told him that the lower classes are animals and will behave as animals as opposed to thinking rational humans.
Just as a quick addendum, I won't go off to a big thing about this because I know we have very little time left. But it seems like a lot of the questions are asking some sort of like, are we sort of orbited around human nature objections to socialism, which is an interesting enough topic that we should do a different debate just about that.
Gotcha. And last one for the night. Thanks, Farron Salas, who says, "Watch me dip, watch me nay, watch me dip, dip, James." Is that the new like cool song, Brenton? Is that okay?
I'm nearly 40, so I don't know, but I know Dip is cool now, and the Whip and Nay Nay is an older song that was cool, 10 years ago?
Thank you for teaching me that. But they said thanks for all you do. So I couldn't thank the speakers more. It's been a true pleasure. So we really do appreciate them, folks. They're linked in the description so that you can hear plenty more from our guests or read plenty more either, as we really do appreciate them. And so we want to say one last final thank you to our guests. And I will be back with a post-credit scene in just a moment to let you know about upcoming debates. Folks, we are excited about those. And so one last thank you, though, everybody, for your questions, and also to our speakers. It's been a true pleasure to have you, Ben, Brenton, Keith, and Todd.
Thanks, James.
Dean, stick around.
All right. Hold on. Windows is in. All right, Ben's coming back on in a few minutes, and we're gonna keep this going. He's gonna do a post-game analysis of his debate performance. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, Ben's coming back on in a few minutes. I guess in the meantime, Biden withdrew. Well, Biden withdrew his near-handed nomination after, I guess, accepting her withdrawal, which seems like it's a I don't know. It seems like it's like almost like a breakup thing. Like, oh, don't worry. Like she withdrew first, but hold on. This is the statement on it.
Statement from President Joe Biden. It says, quote, "I have accepted your attendant request to withdraw her name from nomination for Director of Office of Management and Budget. I have the utmost respect for her record of accomplishment, her experience, and her counsel. I look forward to having her serve in a role in my administration. She will bring valuable perspective to the work." I also, Wolf, want to read, I have obtained the letter that Neera Tanden gave to President Biden requesting the withdrawal. And it reads in part, I appreciate how hard you and your team at the White House worked to win my confirmation. Unfortunately, it now seems clear there is no path forward to gain confirmation, and I do not want continued consideration for my nomination to be a distraction from your priorities. So a couple of elements there that are important. One, this was a request by Neera Tanden to withdraw her nomination. One of the big questions over the course of the last 8 or 9 days was, if Neera Tanden saw that there was no pathway to 50 votes, would she ask the White House?
Yeah. It seems like Biden accepted her request to withdraw her from nomination, which is like a weird, it's like almost like a weird breakup thing, right? Like it's like, or I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it's I mean, whatever. Like, there's a real whiff of you can't fire me, I quit about this. Like, and I'm pretty sure that, like, there's no way in hell. I mean, let's put it this way: like, the whole form of she asked to be withdrawn. It's like, look, there's no way they're not coordinating this among themselves before the public statement. So
somebody definitely put pressure on her and said, like, this isn't going to happen. And I don't know. It sounds like Biden promised her something else that maybe doesn't require a Senate confirmation. Because he said, I look forward to working with her on in some other capacity in this administration. So I don't know who made, like, I don't know what he would offer her, but I mean, there's a ton of, like, non-confirmed positions.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, whatever. Here's the comment that I made about it earlier, early on Twitter, which I would stand by. Which is, I don't think the Neera Tanden thing is a meaningful victory. I do, however, think it's very funny, and that's the spirit in which I plan to continue to cover this.
Yeah, I mean, well, the one not meaningful, but the one victory to it, I guess, is that the person that was up for it behind her, I guess, most likely is more progressive than she is. So having her not nominated that way, but then it's still like she wouldn't have been the one fully in charge of what the Biden administration.
No. I mean, look, she's a Biden appointee. Like, all I really need to know about any of these people is they're Joe Biden's appointees for the head of the Office of Management and Budget. That, like, whatever they're going to do is within the realm of what the Biden administration is willing to do. So, I mean, I think it's hilarious that Neera Tanden, tweets came back to bite her like this. I think that as somebody who's so obviously, it's like. I don't know. It's like watching. It's like if the final, like, the guy in House of Cards never became president, and at the end of all of his striving, it was like, yeah, no, you almost made it, but these tweets are pretty bad. So I'm sorry. Like, after all this sweating and scheming and conniving, that's what gets him not to get it. So whatever. It's not important, but it is hilarious.
Yeah, I'd agree. 100%.
All right. So I've been convinced. I think that innovation can't exist under socialism. I mean, I definitely heard a knockdown argument for that just now.
I mean, I kind of tuned in and out because I, like, ran and cleaned the house a little bit and stuff. But, like, that was a weird debate. Like, it's weird to me that every time a libertarian or like anyone that isn't on the left gets the prompt about socialism in any capacity, they're suddenly not arguing about, like, the actual prompt. They're arguing their opinion on socialism, which is what happens over and over again anytime I've seen that.
Yeah, no, it was really weird. Like, because I just didn't. So Todd was at least making an argument. I don't really know that it had that much to do with innovation, but he was at least making the argument about why socialism is bad. That was all this, like, stuff about the labor theory of value and whether you could use it to determine exact compensation based on labor time, which is actually, if we are going to talk about the Soviet experience, not what they did, and B, it's certainly not anything, that I advocate, or that I talk about in the opening statement, right? But which is having a democratic public sector and having internally democratic worker cooperatives that would set their own pay scales. But like, at least I understood, even if it didn't really have very much to do with innovation, at least he was talking about why socialism is bad. And the Keith part, like, we got a little, like the only like real nod even in the direction of why socialism was bad in the opening statement was that thing about how police are socialist.
Yeah, that doesn't. I mean, there's so many ways to debunk that argument. I feel like too, like like these other, like putting jobs under like a public, I don't know, like a public ownership of any kind. Like, let's say that like your model was the police. Like all these other jobs don't have people with guns going into communities that that have no control over them, and it's just kind of committing brutality at will. And they're not like, I mean, we still have like police kind of are the like in some ways, like at least in richer communities, like the libertarian like state like property enforcers. You know what I mean? Like if you're
right. And again, I mean, like if you don't like people like with guns running around lorded it over ordinary citizens and and enforcing laws and arresting people, the one thing that would be worse than that is having a private entity do that.
Yeah, because they're not, I mean, like and as much as people say like, oh well, they'll be accountable to the market, like they won't be. Like, you know what I mean? Like suddenly like I've heard that argument so many times, like when people are like, oh well, the free market will take care of itself because unpopular services will disappear. But like they're not now. Like
well, and it also doesn't matter if private police forces, private security forces are popular with the general public. In fact, that matters way less than ordinary consumer products because it's not like everybody's buying their own cop. It only matters whether they're popular with the people who sign their paychecks. And we don't have to speculate. We can see how this actually plays out, with private, security forces, like going back to the Pinkertons.
Yeah. And like, I mean, there's the two kinds too, which are like, people like sent into workplaces to clear them out. And then there's also people that are private security in terms of like Wolf of Wall Street style, like guarding somebody's fucking house. And in both cases, it's not good.
Yeah, and I'd also point out that like it's also like a kind of provincial American thing because like not that like police brutality and abuses are limited to America. Of course, they happen lots of places, but also like how bad cops are in America is like it's kind of an outlier. Like certainly by first world standards, like there's a range and there are like several other countries that are almost as bad maybe, but like first of all, just the fact that American cops are armed, there are countries where like at least regular beat cops are not routinely armed. And there are countries like look, I think even social democracy, I think there are countries in Northern Europe where the police ever killing anybody is like fantastically rare. That's like once every 20 years or something.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, I don't know. Even like the UK, like I don't think the UK has like some magical moral.
They have police abuses. There have been riots about it, but it's also not like the United States.
Yeah, they generally show up without like an armed cop first, and then if an armed cop needs to come, they come later. Like I don't know. I mean, even that's an improvement. But like the thing is that the point of police is always going to be to enforce to enforce property rights and to enforce like the will of the state. Like, and so if it's like an unfair status quo, I guess no matter what, like the police are going to be engaging in to some level of brutality. You know what I mean? Like I don't think that you can. I don't know. I'm not like
the more savagely unequal the distribution of resources the police are enforcing is, the more the more brutality you're going to get in that enforcement for obvious reasons. That if you have the same reason, if you have a society where some people are starving, you're going to have to spend a lot of time protecting protecting stockpiles of food or resources that can be used to buy food, because starving people are going to try and take them.
Yeah.
And that's an extreme example, but I mean, the principle applies, much more generally than that.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know. It was interesting reading like Thomas Frank's book, The People Know, because he was talking about when the whole thing that they weaponized against William Jennings Bryan, where the anarchy thing, where they're like, oh, it's going to be total anarchy if he takes over, like that was like the symbol I guess they used, and then it was very clear, I guess, in that within like even like in like the 18 or late 1800s, like that the belief was that police were literally meant to protect property, like what I mean, like the police felt like they had no
yeah. And to be clear, right, like the point is not that police brutality only exists in the United States. The point isn't even that there are any countries where the police never do anything bad. It's that the extent to which this is a problem here really is very different from a lot of, like there are plenty of countries around the world where that are not tiny countries. You have millions of people, living in, where if the police kill one person once, it's like a huge national event. Like how routine it is in the United States, like, is fairly unusual. So like it's one thing to say, look, under capitalism, any policing system, is you're going to be enforcing an unequal distribution of resources. That's going to involve some abusive behavior, but just the idea that like any publicly owned police department is going to be as bad as police departments in the United States, I think is just like I don't think that even takes into account the range that exists right now under capitalism.
Yeah. I mean, the closest like you can even describe to us, I think, is like South Africa. A lot of times, like, has very similar police brutality incidents in some cases. Because this summer, I remember William Shoki talking about it. When he came on TMBS to talk about it, because when the Black Lives Matter movement started, they had like very similar things happen there, and they kind of took cues from the BLM stuff that happened here. So it's interesting that like we're pretty fucking like as usual, like our closest the closest like forms of stuff to us is like, I don't know, it's not like it's not like the where we would want to be by any stretch of the imagination in terms of like how fair a society could be or how non-corrupted a society could be.
No, for sure. But again, like the fact that like, what do we really hear? Like there was the whole weird, like there was the labor theory of value thing. There was police are socialist and police are bad. Which is also just like, even apart from everything we've been talking about, it's also just totally like, it's a not sequitur. It's like, sure, there are lots of things that would be bad no matter who owned them. Like if you had, if you had like Soylent Green factories where, people were being turned into meat, then a worker-controlled Soylent Green factory would still be an evil institution.
Yeah.
But that's not an objection to worker ownership. Like it's just a separate question. And then like other than that, like all I really heard, as far as anything that was relevant to why socialism can't innovate, is this idea that there wasn't that artistic creativity is hampered by having to appeal democratically to the majority of the public, which again just seemed totally weird, because in like the actual country that we live in, the artists who have to cater to what's popular the least are the ones who are funded by the National Endowment for the Arts.
Yeah, I mean, one interesting thing, I guess, is that what's seen as like an artistic way of here, like the Jackson, like have you ever read like any of the stuff about like Jackson Pollock getting funded by the CIA here?
Yeah. Brett brought it up a little bit in the debate, actually. But yeah. So anyway, I mean, I think that maybe someone somewhere has an argument that you couldn't have innovation in a post-capitalist society. I certainly didn't hear it tonight. But I need to watch Scanner Darkly. So,
Okay.
before I go to bed. So yeah.
All right. Well, I don't know. Any final debate thoughts?
Yeah, I guess my final debate thought would be that it'd be really like I want to, next time I do one of these things, I just want to have a buzzer, like, so for like every time somebody brings up the Soviet Union, you know, in order to argue against democratic socialism, you know, can just like buzz it, be like, you know, out of order, bzz, right?
Yeah.
You know,
It seems pretty intent on only bringing up that example.
Yeah, and also actually part two of that thought would be that if people do insist on bringing up the Soviet experience constantly in these debates, they really need to learn something about the Soviet Union, because like a lot of, I mean, that's obviously not the model I would advocate for a post-capitalist society, but I think a lot of the claims that were made about it just aren't true.
Yeah. All right. Well, see you tomorrow for the Scanner Darkly stream.
All right, sounds good. Thanks for watching, everybody. Left is best.